The Biggest Prison on Earth. A History of the Occupied Territories. By Ilan Pappe. To the Palestinian children, killed, wounded and traumatized by living in the biggest prison on earth. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Chapter 9, On the Road to the Intifada, 1977 to 1987. Chapter 10, The First Intifada, 1987 to 1993. Chapter 11, The Oslo Charade and the Second Intifada. Chapter 12, The Ultimate Maximum Security Prison Model, the Gaza Strip. List of maps. Chapter 9. On the Road to the Intifada, 1977 to 1987. On September 26, 1975, Menachem Begin, the leader of what would become the Likud, then in opposition, promised that, if elected, he would never return territories Israel had occupied in the June 1967 war. Either by design or by unexpected development, it transpired that he was only referring to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and in a way to the Golan Heights as well. When, soon after Begin's election, Egypt's President Anwar Sadat made a historic visit to Jerusalem, he did give up territories, but only the Sinai Peninsula. The Camp David Accord that followed was presented as a peace effort that included Palestine's future, but this reference to Palestine was lip service by an Egyptian president who opted to take Egypt out of the conflict with Israel, even if the price was leaving the occupation intact. The Likud took office in May 1977 with the promise of annexing the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to Israel. Its electorate, mainly from the Mizrahi Jewish community, voted for the party in the hope of improving their socio-economic conditions. This is probably why most of them did not much care when it transpired that, all in all, the Likud continued the same policies of control without annexation of the previous government. The Reign of the Settlers, 1977 to 1987. If there were a difference, it was in the Likud's close ties with the settler movement, Gush Emunim. However, there is a clear continuity with the colonization of Palestine before 1967 and after. The impulse for taking over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is the same that led the Zionist leadership to ethnically cleanse much of Palestine in 1948 and to other policies of oppression and dispossession meant against the Palestinians wherever they were. This is why the veteran ideologues of the Zionist labor movement played such a crucial role in the lobby for allowing Jews to settle in the occupied territories after 1967. The settler movement itself was located conveniently, from the perspective of Israel's external image, on the right of the Israeli political system, and thus could easily be distinguished from the secular, social democratic Zionist forces that had conceived and exercised the policy of dispossession since 1882. In essence, however, this colonization drive was born in 1882 and not in 1967. The two motivating forces of the Likud, to cater for the socio-economic problems of marginalized Jewish groups, the Mizrahi and the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and a commitment to a greater Israel, were fused into the particular impact the new government had on the nature of the Judaization of the West Bank. Mizrahi Jews from poor neighborhoods were offered a new life in the West Bank settlements, and to an extent also in the Gaza Strip settlements. They would later be referred to as economic settlers, namely those who, so the Israeli left hoped, in vain, might be returned to Israel with financial compensation. Their younger generation would be indoctrinated by the settler movement. One such graduate was Yigal Amir, who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995. The ultra-Orthodox who had been crammed into inhabitable slums in Jerusalem and Bnei Brak near Tel Aviv, moved to new exclusive ultra-Orthodox towns in the West Bank. Apart from serving the demographic strategy of the Likud government, they were also allowed to create for themselves autonomous theocratic enclaves, immune from Israel's legal practices or cultural norms. Thus, ultra-Orthodox non-Zionist Jews created their devout entities that were not tolerated in the more secular Jewish state and could impose the rule of exclusion and inclusion, which was impossible within the pre-1967 borders. If you want to know what the ultimate theocratic Jewish state looks like, you should visit one of these enclaves. The isolated colony of Kadumim, one of the veteran post-1967 settlements, still exists today as an Orthodox enclave where women wearing trousers are not welcome and men dress like early American settlers in the Wild West, down to their beards and guns in their holsters, like Al-Qaeda fighters. In such colonies, the synagogue is the center of the community and the rabbi's sermons are a mixture of anti-Arab racism and Jewish messianism. The colonies also developed as the equivalent of offshore tax havens. Cheap Palestinian labor was employed, taxes were cut, as the Likud government regarded these colonies as deserving preferential treatment since they were located in security risk areas, which granted them special tax concessions and allowed for subsidy in every aspect of life. A kind of dualism developed. On the one hand, the colonization became the main tool for downsizing the Palestinian presence in the occupied areas, and the settlers became an integral part of Israeli rule in the occupied territories. On the other hand, some sections of this community created a state within a state, which was both challenging and affecting the more secular nature of the Jewish state inside the pre-1967 borders. However, the main change from the previous decade was the license to act freely given by the Likud government to the more ideological religious national settlers. The integration of the more violent settler activity within the overall structure of control was not a feature everyone in the bureaucracy of the occupation welcomed. But the hooligans and vigilantes among the settlers who frequently carried out their own punitive actions, such as uprooting trees, burning fields, or in general harassing Palestinians, were tolerated, as their activity added to the accentuation of Israel's control and presence, especially on the liminal boundaries between the pure Palestinian enclaves and the newly defined no-go areas for anyone who was not a Jew. In 1982, Yitzhak Mordecai, the Central Region commander, decided that a reserve company of settlers would be employed in the Hebron area as a regional defense unit. This model was taken up elsewhere, with settlers serving as soldiers near their colonies, quite often empowering them to intimidate and abuse the local population even more. The Sharonization of the megaprison, the first phase, 1977 to 1987. As noted at the end of the previous chapter, there were clear signs that the Palestinians would not surrender totally to an Israeli dictate. Nonetheless, the Begin government, 1977 to 1981, continued to act as if the formula of an open prison would be attractive to most Palestinians. Begin, notwithstanding his inflammatory rhetoric as opposition leader, was willing as a prime minister to trust the policy makers of the past, and in particular Moshe Dayan. Dayan, as the newly appointed foreign minister, stepped up the marketing of the open prison as a peace plan and found allies in the Arab world who accepted it as a permanent solution for the occupied territories. This was the autonomy plan Dayan brought to the Israeli-Egyptian peace talks in 1979, which included 26 points. All of them in one way or another assumed that the territory's sovereignty, control and resources were to remain forever in the hands of Israel, while the Palestinians, apart from those living in areas designated for Jewish colonization, would enjoy autonomy. The PLO did not remain idle in the face of these developments and intensified its struggle outside Israel, announcing its rejection of this Egyptian, Jordanian, Israeli engineering of the Palestinian issue. In March 1978, the PLO was trying to make its mark on the conflict by hijacking a bus on the way from the north to Tel Aviv and executed an operation that went badly wrong, ending with the death of 35 Israeli citizens. This botched operation gave the Israeli army the ostensible reason to occupy southern Lebanon and meddle in the Lebanese civil war, which had broken out 3 years earlier, by creating its own militia there, the Southern Lebanese Army, SLA, after completing the occupation of southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. 2,000 Palestinians and Lebanese lost their lives in this operation, 20 Israeli soldiers also died, and yet another 250,000 Palestinians and some Lebanese were expelled and had to move north of the river. A new UN body was created, UNIFIL, which observed a shaky truce after the operation and involved the international body in the murky waters of Israel's northern front, with more complications yet to unfold in the future. As a precursor of things to come, shortly after the first UNIFIL soldiers appeared, their barracks were shelled by the SLA, killing 8 members of the UN peace force. The Litani operation, as it was called, was a prelude to a new peace in the overall strategic Israeli puzzle in Palestine. Its aim was to persuade domestic and international public opinion that there was no credible alternative, or force, to Israel's unilateral management of the occupation, and that only the Jewish state could determine the future of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The new piece in the puzzle was translated into an active war against the PLO with the aim of eliminating this alternative voice. The architect of this part of the strategy was Ariel Sharon. The 1973 war hero had, by 1977, become a shrewd politician. The muscle man had turned into an obese, bulky leader whose uncontrollable appetite for good food matched his craving for more land and settlements all over historical Palestine. His first appointment was Minister of Agriculture, which came about when Ezer Weizman resigned as Minister of Defense. As long as Weizman was in office, the Begin government pursued more dovish policies towards the occupied territories based on the autonomy plan agreed with Egypt. In 1980, Weizman felt that he did not receive genuine backing for this policy from Begin and left office bitterly. Sharon hoped to replace him, but Begin, wisely at that time of his life, resisted the temptation and refused to appoint him to this powerful position. Yet, a different Begin would emerge after the elections of 1981, a weaker and more disoriented man, easily manipulated by those around him. The door was now open for Sharon's appointment to the coveted Ministry of Defense. Begin claimed in retrospect that he appointed Sharon as he needed him to dismantle the Jewish settlements in the south and north of the Sinai Peninsula in order to fulfill Israel's obligation under the peace treaty with Egypt, which required Israel to withdraw fully from the peninsula. This might also have paved the way for Sharon to reach the top. It should be said that Sharon delivered the goods, and the eviction of the settlers there was completed in April 1982. Sharon now had license to kill the PLO in whichever way he deemed necessary. His first aim was to disconnect as much as possible the Palestinian territories from their national leadership and movement. Together with his generals in the army, he escalated the tensions on Israel's northern border, preparing for a full invasion of Lebanon in order to eliminate the PLO presence there. His strategy in Lebanon was compounded by a similarly harsh policy in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. One of Sharon's earlier moves was to disband the national bodies that emerged after the 1976 municipal elections, and the first one he dismantled was Lajnat al-Taji, an organization that attempted to coordinate activities during the First Intifada. Since 1977, Sharon had been trying to deepen the level of collaboration and lower the resistance by founding what he believed would be his kind of leadership, an old Zionist, and generally colonial, tactic of finding the leaders of your own choice. It is not clear whether the personalities to whom he gave his blessing saw themselves as his agents or acted in ways that satisfied him. In any case, it was a short-lived episode. The outfits he was encouraging were the brainchild of his Orientalist advisor, a professor from the Hebrew University, Menachem Milson. Milson was brought into the picture as part of another piece in Sharon's overall strategy of trying to establish the open prison as a permanent solution. Sharon abolished military rule in an act that should have enraged the international community, since it signaled the end of the Israeli charade of temporality of the occupation. If there was no military rule, it meant that there was no military occupation, and hence the areas Israel had taken in 1967 were now part of Israel to all intents and purposes. But the world, in particular the USA, maintained the attitude of, "You don't ask, don't tell." The military rule was replaced by a civil administration for Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, and Milson was appointed its first head. 11 Part of this body's authority was transferred to the Palestinian Authority in 1995. So if one day there is a sovereign state in Palestine, namely, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, perhaps this step will be regarded as a positive landmark on the way to Palestinian statehood. I have serious doubts about this as an appropriate narrative, the narrative of an incremental politicide of the Palestinians, which is how the late Baruch Kimmerling described Sharon's strategy, seems a more appropriate way of looking at things at this moment in time. Milson's main interlocutor on the ground was the former Jordanian Minister of Agriculture, Mustafa Dudin. Together they founded the Village Leagues, ostensibly an attempt to improve local life in the rural areas, but in essence a ploy to create an alternative leadership to that of the PLO. The leagues were hated by most, but enlisted tens of thousands of members. The head of the league in Ramallah, Yusuf al-Khatib, was assassinated. The alleged personal corruption of the major personalities involved in the leagues did even less to endear them to the occupied people. The height of their activity was a meeting in 1982 in which they created a movement for democracy calling for peace with, and according to the terms of, Israel. Among other issues, they declared giving up the right of return for the 1948 refugees. When Milson was replaced as the head of the civil administration, his successors, in particular Fuad Ben Eliezer, later on an Israeli minister of defense from the Labour Party, disbanded them and banned their activity altogether. He described the league members as quislings. Sharon's strategy was not only based on destroying the PLO inside and outside or building alternative leadership, intensifying colonization was also an important part of the puzzle. With Sharon's encouragement, the settlers adopted more aggressive colonization tactics. One of the most notorious groups, the settlers of Beit Hadassah in the heart of the old city of Khalil, Hebron, was already making its mark as one of the more fanatic and aggressive bunch of settlers. At the very beginning of May 1980, the harassed Palestinians had had enough and in reprisal killed 6 settlers. The punishment was quick in coming and was a typically stark violation of international law and human rights. The mayor of Khalil, its qadi, judge in a Sharia court, and the mayor of the nearby town Halhul were expelled at the end of that month. Typical of this method of official punishment, It was accompanied by vigilante retaliation by the settlers themselves, who planted bombs in the cars of Bassam Shakeh, the mayor of Nablus, and Karim Khalif, the mayor of Ramallah, both of whom were badly injured. This turned out to be a step too far for the government, who feared this could become a Jewish underground, which is indeed what happened. It transpired that a group of vigilantes was operating under the name the Jewish Underground. They were caught while preparing a terrorist attack on Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, with the intention of blowing up the mosques there, and were even totally outlawed by the Secret Service and the army. While the right-wing government was unhappy about having such vigilante terrorist activity carried out in its name, it looked for other and no less brutal ways to unilaterally solidify the new reality that Israel had created in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of the 1967 war. Apart from the action against the local leadership and the PLO in Lebanon, the Begin government aided the annexation of Jerusalem by passing a new law on July 30, 1980 that defied all the UN resolutions on the city and granted Israel exclusive sovereignty over it. When powerful voices of condemnation from the Vatican, the Muslim world and European powers had no impact on the reality on the ground, it showed once more the immunity from criticism that Israel enjoyed. Sharon's principal activity, however, was in dramatically expand the Judaized areas in the occupied territories, and in particular in the West Bank. The image of his bulky figure, hopping from one hill to another, usually with the aid of a helicopter and a huge bundle of rolled-up maps under one arm, were engraved on the Israeli public consciousness, a testimony to his determination and commitment to the colonization project. More specifically, Sharon was looking for ways of overcoming the hurdle put in his way by the Israeli Supreme Court, which ruled that only public land could be confiscated. Under his guidance, and with the help of the legal experts of the military rule in the occupied territories, the civil administration, land ownership there was redefined in a way that allowed Israel to claim that much of the land was, or would become, state, public, land. One of the leading bureaucrats in the military administration came up with the idea in a meeting Sharon had with all of the relevant officials following another clear decision by the Supreme Court not to allow confiscation of private land. This individual was what one might call an Orientalist, an expert on such subjects as Ottoman law, and he suggested that certain land in the West Bank could be defined as mawat, or dead land, in accordance with the Ottoman land law of the 19th century. According to that law, land that was not cultivated for 3 years could pass into the hands of the Ottoman Empire or state. The next day, Sharon flew off in his helicopter, and in an apparently endless exercise pointed out to his subordinates from the air land that looked deserted, before flying back to instruct his staff toiling away at the drawing board to include it as mawat land on the map. It goes without saying that the Ottoman experience was entirely irrelevant to the colonization of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but it was part of the tacit agreement between the Supreme Court and the existing bureaucracy as to how to kosherize, within a respectable legal infrastructure, the colonization of more and more areas within the West Bank. So the judicial system legalized the land robbery a priori and retrospectively. Such a powerful tool enabled the bureaucrats to grab any land it wanted from either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip for Jewish settlement, military bases, or anything else that was needed to swallow the territories, and without the people. By 1979, the area that was first confiscated for urgent military requirements had been transformed into colonies, such as Matatyahu, Neve Zuf, Rimanim, Beit El, Kochav Hashahar, Alon Shavat, Elazar, Ephrat, Har Gilo, Migdal Oz, Gidi, Yitav, Kiryat Arba, and others. Some of them had grown into little towns and others remained small communities. This new urban sprawl served not only the purpose of territorial expansion of the Jewish state, but also provided major observation and monitoring centers in the midst of the mega-prison the Israelis had built. The Likud government did, in fact, obey one injunction by the Supreme Court that had pronounced the transformation of military bases into colonies illegal. But this first-ever ruling of the court in accordance with international law did not protect the Palestinians from further pillage. It only caused a change in the method, not in the purpose, of the Israeli policies. By 1985, Israel had taken over 2,150,000 dunams, 39% of the West Bank. Almost all of it was public land as previously defined by the Jordanian authorities. The next step was the takeover of private land to complete total spatial control of the West Bank. The expropriation of private land was something never attempted by the Jordanian authorities, nor before that by the British Mandate. Moreover, even the seizure of public land by the Jordanians was limited to the establishment of a few military bases. The appropriation of private land was carried out through Ariel Sharon's trickery, devised by the legal apparatus of the military rule of turning private land into mawat, in an absurd interpretation of the mid-19th century Ottoman law. Contrary to popular belief, the later Oslo Accord was not a game-changer in this respect. The accord, even during its more optimistic phase, introduced only minor changes to this Israeli spatial control. A new wave of energetic decrees followed the peace process, continue, the settlement expansion. What was new was the addition of dozens of bypasses and roads for Jewish use only, for which private land was expropriated, as all the public land had already been taken. A more complex, but equally effective, spatial takeover occurred in East Jerusalem, which was officially annexed to Israel early on, and therefore the same legal practices that were employed in Israel itself, from 1948 until 1967, were intact here. So while Ottoman and Jordanian laws were used to justify the takeover of land in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in East Jerusalem, as they had been since 1970, the Israeli government activated mandatory laws for expropriation of land, as it did in the Galilee and the Negev. There was very little state or public land there, as most of the land stolen in Jerusalem was private. In both Greater Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied territories, limiting Palestinian space was achieved not only through expropriation of land and Jewish colonization. Other means included decrees and regulations that prevented extensions of building and license fees for new ones that were beyond the ability of the average Palestinian to pay. All these initial efforts of de-Arabaizing and Judaizing the occupied space were fused into a more systematic policy with the appointment of Ariel Sharon as the Minister of Housing in the wake of his removal from the Ministry of Defense, in circumstances that will be discussed presently, following the public inquiry into his role in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982. He would remain in this and similar ministerial posts, such as the Minister for the National Infrastructure, which gave him ample resources and license to expand the Jewish colonization of the occupied territories. It was only when he became Prime Minister in 2001 that he and his deputy and successor, Ehud Olmert, in their newly founded party Kadima, would slightly change Israeli policy. They would remove the Jewish settlers from the Gaza Strip and expand even more the Jewish presence in the West Bank. Sharon's principal contribution to the solidification of the mega-prison was a systematic approach that removed any ambiguity in the implementation of the 1967 strategy. He brought colonization to every corner of the West Bank. One significant change was the exclusion of Palestinians from planning bodies and committees. Finding, for instance, that there were token Palestinians in the Planning Council, Sharon replaced it with a new one called the Chamber of Planning, which had hardly any Palestinian members. The Chamber of Planning was an incredibly exercise in cynicism and deception. Officially, its remit was to help with the future development of the 400 Palestinian villages in the West Bank in the next decade, the 1980s. When the chamber announced it would look into planning issues concerning such a large number of villages in the West Bank, what it meant in essence was that it would search for further ways of confining and containing these villages, in order to limit their natural expansion and growth. Such decisions eventually became a mirror image of those taken with regard to the Jewish colonies. Those taken with regard to Palestinians were intended to curb the natural growth of the population, while the Jewish ones were meant to encourage such growth and development. To the outside world, this newspeak bought Israel immunity from criticism. After all, what was wrong with catering to the needs of the occupied rural areas? As noted before in reference to Glenn Bowman's term encista tie-in, forbidding the rural or urban development of Palestinians in the occupied territories was Plan B, for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Expulsion was the preferred alternative, and cessation the second best. The collapse of the open prison model. On June 3, 1982, an attempt was made on the life of the Israeli ambassador in London, Shlomo Argov, while he was leaving a dinner party at the Dorchester Hotel. Hussein Ghassan said, the would-be ass's sin was a member of Abu Nidal, an organization for all seasons. No one ever knew who was employing whom at any point in the story of this group. We know that at one point the group's founder, Abu Nidal, also worked for the CIA, and among his victims were many PLO members, after he left the organization in 1973. But, of course, the identity of the killer was of no interest to Ariel Sharon, who had been preparing an overall assault on Lebanon ever since his appointment as Minister of Defense. The next day, he ordered a massive aerial bombardment of PLO bases in Lebanon, and used the PLO response to activate a plan he had already prepared in 1981. Most accounts say he presented the government with a minimal plan for invasion while enacting a wider one that included, ultimately, the occupation of Beirut and beyond. Israeli atrocities in that war were recorded in Sean McBride's report to the UN in 1983. This Irish statesman, then chair of the UN General Assembly, documented, with his other committee members, the war crimes in great detail. The report was shelved and was completely ignored by the international community. The only global outrage the invasion triggered was the Israeli collaboration with the Maronite Christian militias in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in September 1982. So great was the outcry that it forced Begin to remove Sharon from the Ministry of Defense. Tragically, these horrific events in Lebanon, and this is always true about the correlation between regional developments and Palestine, did not affect Sharon's strategy in the occupied territories. Out of that particular ministry and in command of other minis-tries, Sharon intensified the strangulation policies in the occupied territories well into the mid-1980s. The facts he established on the ground drove home the message of what life would be like in years to come. If the occupied people looked for guidance to their principal representative body, the PLO, they would have found very little response. Since the destruction of its headquarters in the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, it was too far away in Tunis and too disempowered to assist. In the immediate years preceding the First Intifada, it was busy looking for a rapprochement with Jordan, but to no avail. as the Hashemite dynasty was distancing itself from any involvement in the West Bank, as were most of the member states of the Arab League. Inspiration came from elsewhere, from the resistance in Lebanon, by both Palestinian and Charade fighters. At the beginning of 1985, policymakers in Israel were deeply involved in the Lebanese quagmire. Although the occupied territories were relatively calm, the constant interchange of Israeli troops on duty from occupied southern Lebanon, where there was active fighting, to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where they just had to police the areas, has blurred the boundaries of the two arenas. The time was ripe in both occupied areas to try a more active resistance. The armed one in Lebanon was more successful. The non-violent one in Palestine was less effective. From 1985 to 1987, the Israeli army treated the two occupied areas in the same way. Even before the First Intifada, the Israeli army employed what it called an iron fist policy towards any sign of resistance. The open prison model was slowly collapsing. The iron fist policy was executed not by the Likud alone. In 1984, the Likud and Labour formed a unity government that would hold power until 1989. The callous, punitive policy of that government preceded the uprising. Gad Yacobi, who was the Minister of Finance in that government, said years later that the policy was not really a retaliation against Palestinian activity, since there was very little activity. The unity government, he asserted, wanted to accelerate what he called the creeping de facto annexation policy. In hindsight, he regretted that policy, writing that it contributed to a growing militancy of the Palestinian society. Thus, the Israelis themselves could not stick for too long to the open prison model. The only feature of the open prison that remained in place until the First Intifada was the right to work in Israel. Already by 1977, half of the occupied area's hired workers were employed in Israel. It grew from 500 in 1969 to about 100,000 in the 1980s, and the Palestinian areas became, after the U.S., the second preferred destination of Israeli exports. This privilege was actually the right to participate in a modern-day slave market, working with no social rights or health insurance, no unions or labor rights. The privilege, so to speak, was still granted until the outbreak of the Second Intifada. The First Intifada produced some 50 instances of frustrated Palestinian employees venting their fury on their employers, or random people in the street, more often than not using a knife. This wave of violence reached a peak in 1989, and it was the pretext for the beginning of a new policy of barring and limiting Palestinian workers in Israel. The labor market preferred young males, but the security system now barred more and more young men in Israeli building companies, agricultural markets, and in other non-skilled occupations in which a labor force was needed. Israeli experts, who were surprised by the outbreak of the First Intifada, put some of the explanation down to the socio-economic conditions in the occupied territories, which they deemed to have dramatically improved under Israeli rule. Their Palestinian counterparts disagreed vehemently. They claimed that the occupied territories' economy was run very much like that of a colony during the colonial period. Such policies created a total dependency of the colony on the colonist, and in the case of the Palestinian areas led to the ruination of both agriculture and industry. Even if wage earners briefly had a 15% rise in their monthly earnings, compared to the pre-occupation period, with no infrastructure for investment or savings and the rise of the cost of living, this did not mean much at the end of the day. To this can be added the lack of access to traditional Arab export markets and unrestricted competition from cheap Israeli products. Israeli restrictions on Palestinian economic activity and the Israeli claims for land and water resources during the expansion of settlements rendered the additional income insignificant in the long run for most Palestinians. And yet, this was still a more complex reality, as long as the open prison model persisted. The most troubling aspect of it was that any rights to work in Israel, or even to earn a reasonable wage in the occupied territories, were not rights at all, they were rewards. Rewards for good behavior only exist in the world of the prison and detention centers. But within this context, it is important to note that the open prison model enabled daily commuters such as merchants, students, and workers to move freely on the main roads. But it was still a prison, and as much a part of this everyday reality was the Israelis' constant and systematic punitive policy against the Palestinian people. From 1967 to 1982, Israel's military government demolished 1,338 Palestinian homes on the West Bank. Also over this period, more than 300,000 Palestinians were detained by Israeli socio-political forces without trial for various lengths of time. It is indicative of the official Israeli mindset that the oppressive side of the open prison model never seemed to register in the Jewish state's overall strategy. In the analysis of the First Intifada by both mainstream politicians and academics, the collapse of the open prison model was almost exclusively attributed to what were deemed to be faulty prisoner exchanges back in 1985. This was a deal struck with Ahmed Jibril's PFLP organization in the wake of the successful Palestinian abduction of Israeli soldiers in Lebanon. The theory, put forward in the most widely read book in Israel about the First Intifada, by Ze'ev Schiff, the late Haaretz chief military correspondent, and Ehud Yoari, Israeli television's leading Orientalist, was that those released in the deal incited the populace, tie-in, and instigated violence. One reason for the Israeli retrospective attempt to explain the uprising on the Jibril deal was a genuine inability to grasp the level of Palestinian suffering and the evil nature of the Israeli oppression as the main causes for the uprising. This is why the Minister of Defense at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, did not bother to interrupt his visit to the USA and return home when the Intifada broke out. He assumed it was a routine disruption that would soon be over. Finally, in this period it is possible to provide a fine distinction between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Human rights organizers, tie-ins took their time in providing a better idea of the living standards and conditions under the occupation. The first reports suggested that overall conditions in the Strip were incomparably better, and this is confirmed by a kind of oral history of the Strip that one can intuitively refer to. There were, in the words of one report, lesser levels of distress. This could be attributed to stronger traditional structures of society and a greater sense of cohesiveness and solidarity. In August 1987, the Israeli military in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip published a booklet proudly announcing how successful its rule in the last 20 years had been. Color photographs of happy Palestinians were juxtaposed with black and white pictures of gloomy Palestinians from the pre-June 1967 period. The main reason for such pride was the increased standard of living in comparison to the 1950s. Who is to say it would not have grown under Jordanian rule as well, but that was hardly the point. When, 4 months later, the First Intifada erupted, it was clear that the improved standard of living, if indeed this is what it had been, was part of the open prison concept against which the Palestinians rose. The booklet was withdrawn hastily from bookshops at the beginning of the Intifada. But anyone with an eye for the future, and there were a few, men such as the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem turned independent researcher and observer, Marone Benvenisti, understood that the facts on the ground policy dramatically changed the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to such an extent that one uprising could not turn the clock back. As it turned out, two uprisings could not do it either. What changed most was the physical landscape of the occupied territories, in a way that fundamentally limited the living space of their inhabitants. It wasn't just the geography that was altered beyond recognition, the demography was transformed as well. Intensive Jewish colonization was accompanied by the stealthy transfer of Palestinians who left and were not allowed to return. The number of people deported for political activity, quite often without any official charge, was, in 1987 alone, around 1,500. Ostensibly, the reason for issuing a deportation order was to preempt any terrorist activity from the individual being deported. In practice, however, deportation more than once served as a punitive action. Deportation of residents from their homes in occupied territory, whether to another place in the occupied territory or to somewhere outside the territory, is prohibited by international humanitarian law. However, international humanitarian law provides small exceptions by which the occupying state may evacuate residents from their homes, for imperative military reasons or for the greater security of the local population. In such cases, the evacuation must be temporary and, during that time, the occupying power must ensure the basic needs of the evacuees. Israel's previous deportation policy failed to meet either of these criteria and therefore was flagrantly in breach of international humanitarian law. Not that anyone who drafted that law could seriously have believed occupation could continue for more than 4 decades. On top of that, quite often deportees had no idea why they were being treated in such a way. With the coming to power of the Likud, the Labour Party would become more vociferous about such violations. A new reality devil op-ed on the Israeli political map, a voice, which had a party or two representing it in the parliament, that wanted to see nothing less than an unconditional end to the occupation, and which was aroused when blatant violations of human rights were reported, succeeded in enlist the support of about 100,000 Jews on a good day, and half of that for the rest of the year. This was the anti-occupation Zionist left, as ineffective then as it is today. It never associated the occupation with the ills of Zionism itself and therefore could not provide an alternative policy to the center and right of the map, the one that faithfully implemented the strategic decisions described in the opening pages of this book. A few of them did make the connection. The most Zionist among them was Boaz Evren, who left his comfort zone of power and influence for the sake of fighting the occupation. His was one of the lone voices crying in the Zionist wilderness. I make no mention of the others here because I feel they are already well known, but for some reason Evren does not appear among those who deserve to be recorded as part of a more genuine, and less Zionist, dissident movement. Evren was a senior journalist who wrote for a number of newspapers, including Haaretz, and a well-known publicist. What made him cross the line should have alerted many others, but alas it did not. He was moved by the monologue of a soldier who wrote in his kibbutz journal, "Every kibbutz in Israel has a kind of village voice," of what he had seen and done in the occupied West Bank. The soldier told how he and his comrades entered a Palestinian school, locked about 28-year-old boys in a classroom, threw in some gas grenades and kept the children in there for quite a while, causing such panic that at least half of them jumped out of the windows, breaking their legs in the fall. This was a punishment for stone throwing by students from a nearby college, who were not caught. What drew Evren's attention was not so much the horrific story itself, But the fact that the soldier who published the story in a kibbutz publication seemed to believe that telling the story absolved him and his friends from his actions. The same applied to a group of soldiers in a famous publica tie-in, soon after the June 1967 war, entitled Conversations Between Soldiers. The uneasiness Evren felt in 1967 became a review of liberal Zionism and its role in sanitizing and disguising the horrors of Zionist colonization and occupation since 1882. And maybe at the end of the day, given the randomness of the event that eventually triggered the First Intifada, a road accident in the Gaza Strip, it was the daily abuse of basic human and civil rights that became both the hallmark of the enlightened occupation and the most hated aspect of it. Chapter 10. The First Intifada, 1987 to 1993. On December 8, 1987, a truck that killed 4 inhabitants of the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza became the event that signaled the beginning of the first uprising, or the Intifada. Later, historians would point to other discrete violent events before and around that date which signaled the official beginning of the revolt. With historical hindsight, we understand better today that it was not these particular incidents themselves that were so significant, but, rather, the local and popular reaction to them, a reaction that for a while transformed radically the reality on the ground. The way the occupied people reacted to the December 1987 accident triggered a response unprecedented in its intensity and scope. Not since 1937 had Palestine witnessed such mass popular participation against oppression and dispossession. A week later, 6 Palestinians had already been killed in the brutal Israeli retaliation to the stone-throwing, demonstrations and makeshift roadblocks. The number of dead Palestinians rose dramatically in the first few months of the Intifada, most of them killed in non-violent demonstrations. This was followed by mass arrests and a punitive policy aimed at paralyzing life in the occupied territories. Schools were forced to shut down, shops and businesses were closed, and people stayed at home. The international community responded as never before to the occupation. The Palestinians were virtually and visually depicted as brave Davids, confronting ruthless Goliaths, and the images of young boys slinging a stone at a tank became a hallmark of this uprising. Condemnation was heard everywhere, and the UN Security Council was obliged to intervene when the repertoire of punitive Israeli actions started to include mass expulsions as well as other means of coercion. Resolutions 607 and 608 of the Security Council ordered Israel to stop these actions, to no avail. It is hard to define chronologically the Intifada, but it lasted more or less for 6 years. 1,000 Palestinians were killed by the Israelis and more than 120,000 were arrested, many of them under the age of 16. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the open prison model gradually collapsed. Several causes contributed to this. The scholarly and popular literature summarized well the reasons for the initiation of what was overall a campaign of civil disobedience and demonstrations. The uprising was attributed first and foremost to the abuse described so far in this book. Other factors were the economic oppression, the suppression of national rights, the frontal attack on the PLO inside the territories and outside in 1982, the indifference of the Arab world, and a peace process that insisted on finding a way of partition, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip between the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Israel. The uprising was initiated by activists on the ground. A new body, the Unified National Leadership, directed the uprising. So impressed were they with its effectiveness in coordinating the non-violent resistance, namely, an alternative to the PLO, that two Israeli scholars define this as the alternative leadership. This leadership worked mainly through the dissemination of leaflets, the same way, 20 years later, that activists would use Facebook and Twitter for similar purposes. The new body included representatives of the four main PLO factions of the time: Fatah, the PFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Palestinian People's Party. This body formulated the strategy in the early days of the Intifada, in tandem with local ad hoc organizations and a certain level of coordination with the PLO headquarters in Tunis. This synergy propelled a campaign that wanted to compel the world to notice the occupation, and one that hoped to induce the international community to act against the continued oppression and occupation. The uprising began in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza in December 1987. At least, this is the accepted historiographical version. It actually seems that it erupted in different places at the same time. It was a composition of civil action and resistance, general strikes, boycott of Israeli goods, refusal to pay Israeli taxes, the famous stone throwing at the occupation forces, and here and there Molotov cocktails. It also included, alas, account settling with collaborators, a painful reminder of the venom that occupation injects into the bodies and minds of the occupied. Israel reacted to this basically non-violent uprising with great violence. From the very start, the Israeli political and military elite was directed by one basic impulse: anger, and hence most of the Israeli actions in the first year of the Intifada were punitive in nature. The metaphor of prison wardens acting against rebellious inmates seems particularly relevant for our case study. This was graphically instructed by Yitzhak Rabin, the defense minister, when he toured the Jalazon refugee camp near Ramallah. He stated, "The first priority of the SECU righty forces is to prevent violent demonstrations with force, power, and blows. We will make it clear who is running the territories." These blows and the force were translated in many cases into a killing spree that left a large number of demonstrators dead. The outside world watched in bewilderment, as if for the first time ever it was the Israelis rather than the Palestinians who were using force. Those who could still bring themselves to challenge Israel's impunity added a new euphemism to the lexicon of double talk and newspeak, with which the Western world discussed Israel. Israeli policies became manual management of the occupation, and therefore, as shocking as their actions may have been deemed, what they did was merely to employ excessive use, which could be condemned. Excessive use would indeed be employed repeatedly to describe massacres, massive killings, and carpet bombing from the air. At first, the international community, even those among it that were usually pro-Israeli, did not buy into the new euphemism. In fact, the first condemnation of the excessive use of force came from the U.S. State Department. American officials reported to their government that from the very beginning of the uprising, Israeli troops overreacted when faced with unarmed demonstrations that followed the accident in the Jabalia camp. The Palestinians, so the Americans said, saw it as deliberate murder. Soldiers frequently used gunfire in situations that did not present mortal danger to troops, causing many avoidable deaths and injuries. IDF troops used clubs to break limbs and beat Palestinians who were not directly involved in disturbances or resisting arrest. At least 13 Palestinians have been reported to have died from beatings. This overreaction, reported the Americans, escalated as the uprising went on. On 22 December, the Union Security Council followed suit and used even stronger language in condemning Israel in Resolution 605 for violating the Geneva Convention, moved mainly by the high number of fatalities in what was basically an unarmed uprising. There was a certain chilling logic about the escalation. The ineffectiveness of the international rebuke provided the immunity the occupation was seeking for quelling the uprising. Some of the Israelis' punitive actions reminded one of pre-modern age incarceration and imprisonment methods, long outlawed in the civilized world. They included corporal punishment before and during arrests, a method particularly used with children and youths as part of the penalization operation. As the uprising continued, the international community became more aware of the victimization of children that was taking place. The Swedish branch of Save the Children estimated that between 23,600 and 29,900 children required medical treatment for injuries sustained from beatings in the first 2 years of the Intifada, a third of whom were under the age of 10. The international response was somewhat muted when, in the years to come, the uprising was also seen as having been initiated by a new political force on the scene, Hamas. Islamophobia and an intensified struggle between Western powers and political Islamic groups worldwide gave Israel even more immunity as long as its nemesis was a fundamentalist Islamic group. Hamas thus both complicated life for the Israelis and helped them in branding the Palestinian struggle as part of a global anti-Western Islamic force involved in a clash of civilizations. This is why quite a few of the experts who wrote about the origins of Hamas accredited Israel with an important role in its foundation and emergence. The movement was officially founded in 1987 by some members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip, led by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was born in 1948 Palestine in the village of Jura near Ascalon, today's Ashkelon. An accident early in life left him paralyzed and wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life. Like so many of the Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed in the Nakba, his family, too, had found its way to a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, the coastal al-Shadi camp. He was a devout scholar and reader of Islam and very early on joined the Muslim Brotherhood branch in Gaza, where he was politicized and became deeply involved in the struggle for a free Palestine. Yassin and his fellows were able to create a new movement mainly because there was a desperate search for a new national outfit that could deliver salvation where the old ones had failed so abysmally. The secular organizations were considered helpless in finding a way of liberating the homeland. They also became powerful because Israel saw their emergence as a favorable counterforce to the secular national factions, and in particular Fatah. The research substantiating this allegation is still thin on the ground and will probably be delayed until a more peaceful stage in the history of Palestine, if we should ever see such a thing in our lifetime. Hamas's brand of national ideology fused with a political Islamist agenda led it to adopt policies toward the Jewish state, and not just the occupation, that Fatah was slowly forsaking when sucked into the abortive and deceptive peace process. The new stances included a total rejection of Israel and clear demands about the Palestinian right of return. The language employed at the time, however, was strongly anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli, and although it was clear that it was still a Palestinian liberation movement fighting against a century of dispossession, colonization and occupation, and in fact one which was far more involved than other factions in charity, social welfare and education, it provided a pretext for the West to dumb down its criticism of Israel. This would become even more obvious after September 11 and the so-called War on Terror, when there were attempts to associate Hamas and its sister organization the Islamic Jihad with international jihad. But Hamas's pragmatism in the 21st century and the continued brutality of Israel have rendered that kind of justification for Israel's action irrelevant and marginal. When the shootings, the beatings, and the whole-scale arrests began to subside at the end of 1988, Israeli retribution was extended to include the population at large, not just those who had participated in the uprising. Once more, these familiar punitive actions were read as the normal repertoire of rough treatment and severe penalties commonly exercised in the world of the modern-day prison. It is important, even at this late stage in the book, to remind readers once more, if it is not obvious by now, that international law, and indeed civil and criminal law all around the world, state very clearly that any form of collective punishment is illegal. Clause 50 of the 1907 Hague Convention stated unequivocally the international community's rejection of such policies, and this was reiterated by the Fourth Geneva Convention in Clause 33 of 1949. Needless to say, the fact that the Hague Convention was incorporated into Israeli law by legislation, although the Geneva Convention was not, had no impact whatsoever on Israel's punitive policies. Nor did it matter that in 1981 Israel had established the civil administration as a body that allegedly replaced the internationally condemned military rule. Officially, this body was meant to manage the life of the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in all matters that were not security-oriented. However, every action of this civil administration had to be approved by a general in the army who was appointed as active coordinator in the territories. So, in essence, this was just another arm of the Israeli military continuing to inflict the same abusive and punitive actions against the local population. The army was quite inventive when it came to collective punishment against the local population. The civil administration had turned this repertoire of evil into a daily routine. Civil administration. Thus it was the civil administration, and not just the army, that provided, on a daily basis, the human face for what it meant to be subjected to a collective and sustained punitive action against the population as a whole. The worst was probably the restriction on the freedom of movement. The most conservative reports in the archives of memory of what that meant for an average person are the reports of the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. The worst come from the memories of Palestinians, still fresh in the mind 20 years or so later. Even in its most guarded way, the strategy of making movement almost impossible is hard for most people living in the free world to comprehend. In that particular period, 1987 to 1993, every trip took twice as long as it should have and had to be undertaken on new, more dangerous, and less reliable roads. In the open prison days, Jerusalem was accessible to most Palestinians. It ceased to be so under the punitive code. Access to it and through it was denied for Palestinians, which meant that their financial, social, commercial and political hub was inaccessible. With time, even in more relaxed periods, the Israeli authorities retained this kind of blockade, and it would only be towards the end of 2012 that the Western world would recognize that such restriction of movement was not in response to Palestinian aggression but, rather, part of a more systematic plan for the Greater Jerusalem area. When these restrictions were accompanied by massive Jewish colonization in that area, they preempted any chance of implementing a two-state, or any other similar political solution. It was too late for those in the EU who believed they could contribute towards the implementation of such a solution. It was also, as always the case with the EU, a matter of stating the obvious but doing nothing to change it on the ground. The EU declared it understood that what had begun as punitive action rendered any aspiration for Palestinian independence in the West Bank impossible and unrealistic. Needless to say, even in 2012 there were no repercussions from this recognition. Movement was now governed by permits. A particular nuisance was the need to be physically present when these permits were requested. The civil administration had several headquarters. One of them was located on the northern border between the new Jewish colonies of Greater Jerusalem, Pisgat Ze'ev and Neve Yaakov. This was the main headquarters of the civil administration. All major decisions about people's lives were taken there between 1981 and 1993. The civil administration not only regulated the freedom of movement, it also had the power to rob anyone it wished of the right to work, to study, to build and to trade. Any such elementary activity required a permit that would be withheld or denied. The very location of this headquarters was one of the main obstacles to freedom of movement for anyone living there. As time passes and our memories become blurred, I should emphasize that I am describing here a pre-Oslo reality. It would, of course, become worse when the Oslo cartography bisected the West Bank and the Gaza Strip into official no-go areas for the Palestinians. I am describing a siege reality, long before the Israeli authorities could justify it under the pretext of defending themselves against suicide bombs and terrorism. This was a response to the 1987 attempt by the Palestinians to shake off peacefully a 20-year-old occupation. In those days, Palestinians were not allowed to drive in this Weissen ity. In fact, Palestinians were prohibited from using cars in roads close to settlements, army bases or offices of the civil administration. The headquarters in the northwestern side of Jerusalem seemed to be the source of all evil, the magnet of brutality. The closer you lived to it, the less normal your life became, to the point of it being unbearable. This monstrous headquarters on the hill truly reflected the cynicism and inhumanity of the administration. This was a location that had to be visited frequently but could not be reached easily. You could not get there by car. Nor could you easily walk there. There was no footpath to the civil administration, since there was no paved way, and the only passable route was dangerously close to the Pisgat Ze'ev and Neve Yaakov settlements. A Palestinian who walked in this way endangered his life, as soldiers and settlers who would notice him could have harmed him, warned a report from B'Tselem at the time. The daily routine of permits and blockades was interrupted by more severe restrictions on human movement. The worst was the frequent closures. The pretexts for such closures varied. They might be in response to Palestinian protests, a peaceful demonstration or a terrorist attack, to Jewish holidays, public events or a religious seal, Brat Ion in one of the many settlements. All such events were considered equally justifiable reasons for enforcing a closure. This was the pretext, but not the usual reason, for closures. In most cases, the purpose was to tighten the supervision, and the closures were used to round up people, suspects, as the Israelis called them, accompanied by the confiscation of inciting material and the search for arms. Such actions were usually conducted with violence, leaving a scene of havoc and destruction in the homes visited. The members of the household were beaten, abused, and their furniture destroyed. These victims of brutality should be given names, and I shall do this presently. The calendar of the occupation. A more reduced form of closure was the curfew imposed by the army for a few days on towns and villages and during Jewish festivals on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as a whole. This kind of action began in 1967 in the early days of the occupation and continued daily. I have chosen one year in particular, 1993, on the very eve of the Oslo Accord, to illustrate what kind of a reality the Accord promised, and utterly failed, to achieve. As one NGO monitoring the curfew policy noted, every Palestinian living in the occupied territories had spent an average of 10 weeks under house curfew. the worst period in the calendar of the occupation. Apart from the aftermath of a particularly daring or violent operation by one of the Palestinian factions, was the 3 days around Israel's Day of Independence, celebrated according to the Hebrew calendar, which in 1993 occurred in April. The town of Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip, like all the other towns and villages in the West Bank and the Strip, was placed under military curfew for 3 days. This short period was enough for the army to perform its routine devastation. Muhammad Ahmad al-Astal, who was then 24 years old, recalled how the soldiers burst into the house where his friends usually gathered, about 10 Palestinian men in all. The soldiers took 4 of them to another room. He remained with 3 other members of the family. 2 of them were taken by the soldiers to a corner of the room and beaten with rifle stocks. They were also punched, slapped, and kicked. He and another family member were ordered to empty the cupboard of its contents, clothing, and other household items. In his own words, the soldiers called me over, slapped me on the face and told me, "You are Hamas." I returned to empty the cupboard, but I was called over again. This time they told me, "You are Islamic Jihad," and slapped me again. There was a third round of abuse in which he was told, "You are PLO." Another man in the room was treated in a similar way. Then they were both summoned. One soldier held me by the neck and banged our heads together. It turned out that in the next room the same abuse was taking place, and then they were united with 2 men from the other room, and ordered to stand facing the wall with their hands up in the air. The soldiers gave us back our ID cards to hold up in the air and told us to remain like this. After half an hour, the older members of the family told them the soldiers had left. Hassan Abd al-Saidi Abu Labeda, 29 years old and married with 2 children, also a resident of Khan Yunis, was woken up by soldiers at 2 in the morning with a blow in the face from a soldier's rifle, followed by more blows. His brother Manor, 23 years old, was taken out of his bed and thrown onto the family car, parked in the yard. The soldiers asked about the whereabouts of Jamal Abu Samhadana, a man he did not know. He was punched in the face and then forced into the routine emptying of cupboards. The soldiers cut up the sofa with a knife. And in his own words, "They found a kitchen knife in the kitchen." "What is it?" "It is a bread knife," I answered. The soldiers punched me on the nose with the knife. I was wounded and bled. The soldier took a sack of rice and demanded that I empty it on the floor. I said it was only rice, so he emptied it himself and then took an oil can and poured it on the cloths and the rice. They left. Nobody was arrested and nothing was taken. Fatma Hassan Tabash Sufyan, 61 years old, married and a mother of 4, was woken up on April 6, 1993 at 3 o'clock in the morning. Soldiers broke into her house, pushed her up against the wall and asked her where her children were. "They are asleep," she replied. They woke up her son Saad, 30 years old, kicking him and beating him with their hands and rifle stocks, until he was spitting blood all over the place. Her other son, Ibrahim, was badly beaten, and the B'Tselem researcher who took Fatma's evidence testified that long after the incident he could still see signs of ecchymosis, subcutaneous bleeding, on his back. Both sons were taken out to the yard and put against a wall. The soldiers found 2 toy guns and began slashing the 2 men with them until the toys broke. Then they gathered everyone in the complex, 27 people, into one room and threw in a shock grenade. Saad and Ibrahim were ordered to empty the cupboard while they were continuously beaten by the soldiers shouting at them, "You are Hamas and we are Golani," the name of the military brigade to which they belonged. Nor did they spare Fatma's old, blind brother who was 100 years old. He too was abused by the soldiers, who threw mattresses and blankets at him. Thus, every April from 1987 until 1993 this was the routine of the collective punishment. But it was not only these 3 days that mattered. Collective punishment in May 1993 robbed 116,000 Palestinian workers of their source of living, bisected the occupied territories into 4 disconnected areas and barred any access to Jerusalem. Seen from that perspective, when the Oslo Accord was implemented as a territorial and security arrangement, it was just official confirmation of a policy already in place since 1987. Consolidating methods of oppression. The years 1987 to 1993 were indeed a formative period during which some of the realities of today, in the West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip until 2005, were formulated. It was a time during which the bureaucracy of occupation showed its absolute power by transforming ad hoc policies, including punitive ones, into routine policies. This is how the checkpoint system was introduced to the world. It was put into systematic effect in 1993. Just before Israel publicly signed a peace agreement with the PLO, the Israeli government of the time experimented with the first set of checkpoints in Jerusalem, although these were used extensively in the Palestinian areas inside Israel during the period of the military rule there, from 1948 to 1967. Installing checkpoints started out as a policy aimed at excluding Jerusalem from the West Bank and a more determined wish to de-Palestinize it. This system was in a way the inevitable continuation of the wedge policies described in Chapter 4. The planning of the wedges and the installation of the checkpoints would later be followed by the actual and final physical construction of the wedges. So it was around 1987 that a chain of checkpoints and physical barriers appeared around the city entrances, hindering access to places of worship, employment, education, institutions, and families. When the Oslo proposal was put on the table by Israel, its leaders already knew they had established irreversible facts on the ground in Jerusalem that would defeat the very notion of peace. Israel's calculated strategy of extricating Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank rendered any suggestion of making Jerusalem the capital of a future Palestinian state both hollow and impossible. This entire maneuver would be completed with a hurried settlement of Jews in the area that would tip the city's demographic and geographic balance in favor of Jewish residents. A similar praxis that became a fact of life was the dramatic change in the function and purpose of the IDF's elite units. These became death squads and agents provocateurs during Palestinian demonstrations, dressed in civilian clothing or wearing full military gear when attacking the enemy, more often than not a poor dwelling in a refugee camp. No wonder these units had strong parallels with, and developed similar weaponry and other lethal means of warfare to, the death squads that operated in the favelas of Brazil. People whom Israel was obliged by international law to bring in front of a court of law were executed before it was established whether they were guilty or not. The units spearheaded the operations of mass arrests and the systematic abuse and torture of those arrested. It is very disappointing that the world continued to remain silent at that point, because that particular activity was investigated by a few American congressmen, a rarity in the history of the occupation. Paul Findley reported in 1991 that human rights groups had published detailed credible reports of torture, abuse and mistreatment of Palestinian detainees in prisons and detention centers. Although this was totally ignored by Western governments, it did generate for the first time a far wider response from what one might call Western civil societies. a more genuine and widespread movement of solidarity emerged, to this day still unable to impact the policies of the governments and hence the reality on the ground. Needless to say, this kind of treatment reported by Findlay was not unique to 1991. The people arrested during the punitive years were added to the thousands who had already been in jail since June 1967. Maybe what was different was the growing media transparency and exposure of information which allowed people around the world to see for themselves, without relying on Israeli narrative and propaganda, the daily reality. A process that would be reinforced with the arrival of the first young volunteers of the international solidarity movement in the occupied territories. The first shocking aspect for a world that could now see with its own eyes what it meant be on the receiving end of Israeli cruelty was the high number of children and women among this never-ending community of suffering. Quite a few aspects of the punitive action were still hidden from the public eye in the early 1990s. They would become an integral part of the reality in the years to come. To those already mentioned can be added the prevention of work inside Israel. In 1992, a third of the Palestinian workforce was employed in Israel, mostly in low-skilled, manual labor jobs in construction, agriculture, and government services. This contributed 25% of the territory's GNP. The denial of the right to work became part of the punitive action. The fact that even in the days of the open prison, up until 1987, Palestinian exports to Israel constituted only 1% of the aggregate Israeli market, and the workers formed only 7% of the Israeli labor market, this showed that economically you could impose a mega prison without integrating the two economies. The Israeli success in this respect transpired clearly only in the 1980s, and thus the fears of Pinchas Sapir, the former finance minister of the 1967 government, described in Chapter 3, proved to be unfounded. When the punishment became, like so many of the other punitive actions, a part of the reality of the mid-1990s, Israel replaced Palestinian labor, primarily in construction and agriculture, with low-paid workers from foreign countries. It was the nature of such economic dependency that while the Israeli economy was not affected by the end of Palestinian labor at its very heart, this new development had a devastating effect on the occupied territories. Unemployment increased, driving down family income and living standards. This was not about economy but about incarceration, penalization, and oppression. Alas, the list of state-sponsored brutality did not end there. The Palestinians faced demolition of their houses, unlike before, this time without prior warning, the destruction of their rural infrastructure, the uprooting of olive trees and the ruination of crops, and probably the most sinister of all in this list of evils, the redirection of water away from their towns and villages, in many cases to the benefit of Jewish settlements, which, after the Intifada, sold that water for a higher price back to the Palestinians from whom the water had been stolen in the first place. The head of the Israeli military intelligence, Shlomo Gazet, whom we met as the first coordinator of the military rule after 1967, explained that this destruction of the infrastructure was intentional. Israel wanted the Palestinians to face unemployment and a shortage of land and water, and thus we can create the necessary conditions for the departure of the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. On top of all of these measures during the period when the OFFI-style mentality in Israel was that the occupied people had to be punished, there was yet more license for the settlers' violence and intimidation. In periods like this, the courts were particularly lenient in their attitude to the killing of Palestinians by settlers. Of the 48 8 cases concerning the killing of Palestinians between 1988 and 1992 by settlers. Only one culprit was charged with murder. Settlers also abused life in other ways. In those years of peace, they were allowed to act as organized gangs terrorizing the Palestinians around them. It began in the early 1980s and has not stopped. It appeared first as the famous Jewish Underground, that in 1981 targeted the political elite of the West Bank, seriously wounding several leading politicians, and then became a more systematic form of aggression that escalated during the days of the maximum prison model of 1987 to 1993, and from 2000 until today. And, indeed, once the First Intifada broke out in 1987, settler provocation against the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip increased and became more brutal by the day. At the time, the settlers were mercilessly using their own children to provoke aggression, as happened in the village of Beita, a few miles southeast of Nablus. There, in January 1988, a battalion commander rounded up a large number of youths from Beita and the nearby village of Hawara, tied their hands behind their backs and ordered his soldiers to ruthlessly beat them with sticks and rocks. This was caught on camera, and the officer was subsequently tried and discharged from the army, and became quite a sought-after TV pundit afterwards. But this did not end the trials and tribulations of this village. 3 months later, in April 1988, 16 Israeli boys and girls from the neighboring settlement of Alon Mor set out on a journey of provocation into the village of Beita. Their armed escort opened fire on Palestinian youths who threw stones at them, and in the raging whirlwind of the confrontation that developed, 2 Palestinian youths, 1 settler girl and an armed escort were killed. The village was severely punished as a result. The final act in this punitive period of imposing the maximum security model on the people was the massive expulsion of activists, at the very end of 1992. This was the year Labour returned to power after a long period of Likud rule. Yitzhak Rabin was elected as the new prime minister that summer, his second and last term in office before his assassination by a Jewish terrorist in 1995. The expulsion ended a long phase of harsh confrontation between Hamas and the Israeli army that had begun in the late 1980s. The charismatic but crippled Ahmed Yassin, who became a moral yardstick for the Hamas movement, was behind several daring operations against Israeli soldiers and settlers. Each such operation, however, offered further opportunities for the Israelis to impose harsher versions of the various punitive actions. The brutalization of the actions was not only the result of the new methods of resistance offered by the various Palestinian factions, the worst of which were suicide bombs inside Israel. It was also caused by the almost total obedience of the legal system to the whims and requests of the government and the army. This enabled the politicians and generals to go beyond the red lines the Israelis had created for themselves. Around the mid-1990s, the Israeli judicial system became unconditionally and organically integrated into the running of the mega-prison, even in its most vicious and ultra-high security version. The legal charade. The bureaucrats who run the legal side of the mega-prison are some of Israel's finest. Since 1967, Israeli law faculties have produced Anu Ally, among other graduates, one particular group of proud licenti Atesh, the jurists who would grace the Israeli judicial system with their wisdom and expertise. This system was, and still is, very active as a governmental tool against the Palestinian population in the occupied territories, both as part of the web of military courts in the territories themselves and as a system of civil courts inside Israel proper. It is in these law schools that the future members of Israel's legal system, the ultimate manifestation of Israel's claim for being a liberal democracy, acquired the qualifications needed to operate the massive machinery of arrests and detention, in action ever since 1967. Thousands of Palestinians passed along the legal Via Dolorosa paved for them by the State of Israel. The stations on that road are familiar by now: arrest, interrogation, detention for many days without telephone contact or access to a lawyer, appearance in court several times for the extension of the detention, and then a long period in jail without trial as part of administrative detention. The numbers were already staggering in the early 1990s. Until the outbreak of the Second Intifada, it already looked like a huge campaign of arrest that systematically violated the Fourth Geneva Convention on Human Rights adopted in 1949. Up until 1992, some 14,000 people had been subjected to this process. Israel's immunity from prosecution is best demonstrated by judges' blind application of this inhuman method to any Palestinian action, be it a violent attack or a Gandhi-like nonviolent protest movement. In 1989, local committees in the village of Beit Saur initiated a nonviolent movement that called upon the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to join a tax rebellion, their slogan being, "No taxation without representation." The response came quickly, and typically, from the then Minister of Defense in the Labor, Likud Unity government, Yitzhak Rabin: "We will teach them there is a price for refusing the laws of Israel." When incarceration in prison failed to stop the activists, Israel crushed the boycott by imposing heavy fines, and seizing and disposing of equipment, furnishings and goods from local stores, factories, and homes. But you could be subjected to the same treatment for less. A common, non-violent Palestinian form of protest in those days was the use of graffiti to express resistance. This often led to the arrest and collective punishment of the entire family of the perpetrator. The intensification of the Palestinian struggle, spearheaded by the political Islamic and left groups, numbed the Israeli legal system even further. The judges were particularly blind to the way coerced collaboration sustained the judicial system. It was no different from a Stasi state, where it was possible to arrest and punish without a reason, but it sat better if an informer provided the evidence. The construction of such an elaborate system reached new levels in the early 1990s. The judges provided the collaborators, and the Secret Service furnished the evidence from these collaborators. The judicial system of arrest without trial gave the Secret Service an opportunity to coerce people into collaborating in return for a reduced sentence. Such collaborators were not released immediately so as not to raise suspicion, which did not help them since everyone already inside knew what was going on. In this way, the Secret Service recruited hundreds of Palestinians and actually succeeded in planting informants inside Hamas and its sister organization, the Islamic Jihad. Unfortunately, it also triggered a ruthless counter-campaign of punishing collaborators. Between 1987 and 1992, several hundred, there are conflicting accounts, Palestinians were killed for being such collaborators. The Israelis were not genuinely worried about the internal Palestinian engagement with the issue of collaboration, as many of those who were deeply involved in such collaboration would find out. Whether they were from Lebanon, the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip, Israel always deserted them at some point. Although others were offered sanctuary inside Israel, they were pushed to the criminal margins of society and created a hub of disquiet and intimidation among the Palestinian communities already inside Israel, which were forced to accept their presence in their midst. The Israeli fake concern for the fate of the collaborators was manifest when the spiritual leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, was arrested, allegedly for this incitement against collaborators. His arrest was the opening shot of the first of many Israeli attempts to wipe out Hamas. Yassin was blamed by the Israeli army for being behind the abduction of 2 soldiers who were later killed, and therefore he was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1991. When the body of the second soldier was found, as well as arrest, Yassin, the army rounded up more than 1,000 Hamas activists and expelled 415 of them to southern Lebanon. This was such a stark violation of any international convention that even the American administration, these were the days of Bill Clinton's first term, was furious and threatened to join a condemnation of Israel in the UN Security Council. And thus most of those who were expelled were allowed to return after a relatively short period. I once gave a lecture to a typical Israeli Jewish audience on that particular period in history leading up to the Oslo Accord, and ended it with condemnation of this expulsion. The usual response from the audience was that this was a perfectly reasonable reaction, like all the other punitive actions Israel carried out, which the listeners admitted were quite ruthless and inhuman with regard to the Palestinian suicide bombs. All my efforts to explain that suicide bombs began after the expulsion and were not the cause of the expulsion were in vain. The first suicide bomb attack was launched on April 16, 1993, directed at soldiers at one of the checkpoints. So this form of action, which was first practiced against soldiers and only later against civilians, was the consequence of the punitive action, not the reason for it. This does not mean that Israeli civilians were not targeted or killed during the First Intifada. In fact, 16 of them were, as well as 11 soldiers. The number of wounded was much higher. More than 1,400 Israeli civilians and 1,700 Israeli soldiers were injured. Not surprisingly, the official Israeli narrative of the First Intifada for domestic and external consumption was that the Israeli army was fighting terrorist organizations. The international community, including the U.S. administration for the first time since 1967, refused to accept this narrative. The Intifada, and the positive international reception to it, led a group of young Israeli politicians and academics to offer a new version of the open prison model. They suggested deterrorizing the PLO and allowing it to run the prison instead of Israel. To my great shame, I was one of this group, albeit playing a very marginal role at the beginning of the process. In September 1993, this formula became the famous Oslo Accord. It was an important move because there was a genuine opportunity for the world to react to what were now clearly the real intentions of Israel on the ground, and then came the Oslo Accord, which mesmerized, almost anesthetized, Western consciences. It was also a moment of opportunity, to my mind the last one, to free the occupied territories and experiment seriously with the idea of a two-state solution. Although I do not believe this would have been the right solution, it nonetheless could have been more seriously tested. During the First Intifada, the Palestinians began to build from their meager means and resources an independent structure for their society. They made do with Israeli goods, established their own mobile medical clinics, and provided independent social services, such as distributing food and clothing for those in need. The restrictions Israel imposed on universities and high schools led to underground teaching with high-quality learning, and other aspects of independence began to mature. Even the issue of security was addressed in an unprecedented manner. There was no sense of lawlessness as the body coordinating the uprising, named by the locals as the Unified Command, organized local watches over villages and refugee camps at night against army and settler raids. Security was not used to serve as the extended arm of the Israeli forces, but was employed for self-defense. It was also a moment when collective national pride was directed towards constructing a new reality, not just destroying an old one. Or, as the Australian social activist Sonia Carker put it when summarized the First Intifada, it was a moment of national empowerment. 45 In particular, it was true for women, who established committees in their struggle to shake off not only the occupation but also the more oppressive side of tradition. This was another missed opportunity to build an alternative reality. If only the West had been willing to deem the Intifada as a legitimate liberation struggle or the precursor of the Arab Spring. The Palestinian flag and its colors, rather than weapons or the blood dripping from a map of the homeland, became the symbol of the day, whether it was waved over rooftops or sewn into clothing and embroidery. In the end, the first uprising produced another version of the open prison model, and when this collapsed, another far more severe uprising broke out. The Israelis quelled the second uprising with a severe model of an ultra-security prison in 2000, which lasted for a few years and was transformed by a mixed model of both around 2005. Chapter 11. The Oslo Charade and the Second Intifada. On September 13, 1993, Israel and the PLO signed a declaration of principles, known as the Oslo Accord, on the White House lawn under the auspices of President Bill Clinton. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres would later receive a Nobel Peace Prize for this agreement. It ended a long period of negotiations between the PLO and Israel that began in 1992. Until that year, Israel refused to negotiate directly with the PLO over the fate of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or about the Palestinian question in general. Successive Israeli governments preferred negotiating with Jordan, but since the mid-1980s had allowed PLO representatives to join the Jordanian delegations. There were several reasons for the change in the Israeli position that enabled direct negotiations with the PLO. The first was the victory of the Labour Party in the 1992 elections, for the first time since 1977, and the formation of a government that was more interested in a political solution than the previous Likud-led ones. This government understood that its attempt to negotiate directly with the local Palestinian leadership about autonomy was stalled, because every Palestinian decision was referred back to the PLO headquarters in Tunis. Thus, a direct line was more useful. The second reason was the Israeli apprehensions from the Madrid Peace Initiative, an American enterprise to bring Israel, the Palestinians, and the rest of the Arab world to agree on a solution after the First Gulf War. President George Bush Sr. and his Secretary of State, James Baker, fathered this initiative in 1991. Both politicians asserted that Israel was the obstacle for peace and pressured Israel to agree to a halt of settlement building so as to give a two-state solution a chance. Israeli-American relations at this time were at an unprecedented low. This administration also initiated direct contact with the PLO. The Madrid Conference of 1991 and the peace efforts conducted under its aegis were probably the first genuine U.S. effort to offer a solution for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip based on Israeli withdrawal. The Israeli political elite wanted to thwart the move and nip it in the bud. They preferred to initiate their own peace proposal and convince the Palestinians to accept it. Incidentally, Yasser Arafat also was unhappy with the Madrid framework since the local Palestinian leadership in the occupied territories, headed by the Gazan leader Haidar Abdul Shafi and Faisal al-Husseini from Jerusalem, in his eyes threatened his leadership and popularity by taking the lead in these negotiations. Thus the PLO in Tunis and the Israeli Foreign Office in Jerusalem began backtrack negotiations while the Madrid peace effort continued. They found a willing mediator in FAFO, a Norwegian research foundation based in Oslo, for these early negotiations. The two teams eventually met in the open in August 1993 and, with American involvement, finalized the Declaration of Principles. This was hailed as the end of the conflict when it was signed with a lot of histrionics on the White House lawn in September 1993. There are two myths associated with the Oslo process. The first is that it was a genuine peace process at all, and the second is that Yasser Arafat wrecked it intentionally by instigating the Second Intifada as a terrorist operation against Israel. The first myth was born out of the wish by both sides at the beginning of the process in 1992 to reach a solution. However, when this failed, it quickly became a game of who to blame. The hardliners pointed the finger at the Palestinian leadership. A more nuanced, and a liberal Zionist, version of this assumption laid the blame on Yasser Arafat until his death and on the Israeli right, in particular Benjamin Netanyahu, for the impasse after the PLO leader's death. In either scenario, the peace process was a real one, albeit a failure. However, the truth is more complex. The terms of the negotiation were impossible to fulfill. The claim that Arafat refused to respect the Palestinian pledges made in the 1993 accord does not bear scrutiny. He could not enforce pledges that were impossible to keep. For example, the Palestinian authorities were called upon to act as Israel's SECU-righty subcontractor inside the occupied territories and assure there would be no resistance activity. More implicitly, Arafat was expected to accept the Israeli interpretation of the final settlement emerging from this accord without debate. The Israelis presented this fait accompli to the PLO leader in the summer of 2000 at the Camp David summit, where the Palestinian leader was negotiating the final agreement with the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, and President Clinton. Barak demanded a demilitarized Palestinian state, with a capital in a village near Jerusalem, Abu Dis, and without parts of the West Bank such as the Jordan Valley, the big Jewish settlement blocks and areas in Greater Jerusalem. The future state would not have an independent economic and foreign policy and would be autonomous only in certain domestic aspects, such as running the education system, tax collection, municipalities, policing and infrastructure maintenance. The formalization of this arrangement signified the end of the conflict and terminated any future Palestinian demands, such as the right of the 1948 Palestinian refugees to return. Partition. The peace process was a busted flush from the outset. In order to understand better the failure of Oslo, one has to widen the analysis and relate the events in particular to two principles that remained unanswered throughout the process. The first was the primacy of geographical or territorial partition as the exclusive foundation of peace, and the second, the denial of the Palestinian refugees' right of return and its exclusion from the negotiating table. The proposition that the physical partition of the land was the best solution for the conflict appeared for the first time in 1937 as part of the British Royal Commission's Peel Report. At that time, the Zionist movement offered that Jordan, Transjordan in those days, would annex the Arab parts of Palestine, but the idea was rejected by the Palestinians. It was later readopted as the best way forward in November 1947 in the UN Partition Resolution. The UN Special Commission on Palestine, UNSCOP, was established to try to find a solution. The members of the commission came from countries that had very little interest in and knowledge of Palestine. The Palestinian representative body, the Arab Higher Committee, and the Arab League boycotted UNSCOP and refused to cooperate with it. This left a vacuum filled by the Zionist diplomats and leadership, who fed UNSCOP with ideas for a solution. The Zionist leadership suggested the creation of a Jewish state over 80% of Palestine. The Commission reduced it to 56%. Egypt and Jordan were willing to legitimize the Israeli takeover of Palestinian land that it occupied in 1948, in return for bilateral agreements with Israel, which were eventually signed in 1979 with Egypt and in 1994 with Jordan. This then resurfaced as a formula for peace in the efforts led by the Americans after 1967, when the concept of partition reappeared in different names and references. It was hidden as a discourse with the emergence of two new concepts. The first was territories for peace, which every peace negotiator treated as a sanctified formula for peace. The more territory Israel withdrew from, the more peace it would get. Now the territory in Palestine that Israel could withdraw from was within the 22% it had not taken over in 1948. Therefore, in essence, the idea was to build peace on the basis of partitioning the remaining 22% of Palestine between Israel and whoever it would legitimize as a partner for peace, which at first were the Jordanians until the late 1980s, and then the Palestinians ever since. Unsurprisingly, therefore, it became the cornerstone of the logic that informed the opening discussion in Oslo. However, it was easily forgotten that every time in history when partition was offered, it was followed by more bloodshed and did not produce the desired peace. Yet at no point did the Palestinian leaders ever demand partition. It was always a Zionist and, later, an Israeli idea. In addition, the proportional share of territory demanded by the Israelis at each instance grew as their power increased. Thus, as partition gained growing global support, it increasingly appeared to the Palestinians like an offensive strategy by other means. It was only due to a lack of alternatives that the Palestinian parties accepted this set of circumstances as the lesser evil within the terms of negotiation. In the early 1970s, Fatah acknowledged partition as a necessary means on the way to full liberation, but not as a final settlement by itself. So, in truth, without the application of extreme pressure, there is no reason in the world why a native population would ever volunteer to partition its homeland with a settler movement. And therefore we should see that the Oslo process was actually not a fair and equal pursuit of peace, but a compromise made by a defeated, colonized people. As a result, the Palestinians were forced to seek solutions that went against their interests and endangered their very existence. This same argument can be made about the debates concerning the two-state solution that was offered in Oslo. However, this offer should be seen for what it is: partition through different wording. Even in this scenario, although the terms of the debate appear different, Israel would not only decide how much territory it concedes but also what would happen in the territory it leaves behind. While the promise of statehood initially proved persuasive to the world and to some of the Palestinians, it soon came to sound hollow. Nonetheless, these two intertwined notions of territorial withdrawal and statehood were successfully incorporated as parts of a peace deal in Oslo in 1993. Yet, within weeks of the joint signature of the Declaration of Principles on the White House lawn, the writing was on the wall. By the end of September, the vague principles had already been translated into a new geopolitical reality under the terms of what was called the Oslo II, or Taba, agreement. This included not just partitioning the West Bank or the Gaza Strip between Jewish and Palestinian zones, but partitioning further all the Palestinian areas into small cantons or bantustans. The Peace Cartography, or map, of 1995 was a bisected Palestinian series of zones that resembled, in the words of quite a few commentators, a Swiss cheese. After this program became clear, the decline of the negotiations was swift. Before the final summit meeting in the summer of 2000, Palestinian activists, academics and politicians had realized that the process they supported did not incur an actual Israeli military withdrawal from the occupied territories, nor did it promise the creation of a real state. The charade was unmasked and progress ground to a halt. The ensuing sense of despair contributed to the outburst of the Second Palestinian Uprising in the autumn of 2000. The Oslo peace process did not fail only due to its adherence to the principle of partition. In the original accord there was an Israeli promise that the three issues that trouble the Palestinians most, the fate of Jerusalem, the refugees, and the Jewish colonies, would be negotiated when the successful interim period of 5 years came to an end. Within this interim period, the Palestinians had to prove they could serve effectively as Israel's security subcontractors, preventing any guerrilla or terror attacks against the Jewish state, its army, settlers, and citizens. Contrary to the promise made in the Oslo Declaration of Principles, when the 5 years of the first stage was over, the second stage, in which the more substantial issues for the Palestinians were meant to be discussed, did not commence. The Netanyahu government claimed that it was unable to begin the more substantial phase in the negotiations because of the Palestinian misbehavior, which included incitement in schools and weak condemnations of terror, attacks against soldiers, settlers, and citizens. In truth, however, the process stalled mainly because of the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, in November 1995. His murder was followed by the victory of the Likud party, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, in the 1996 national elections. The new prime minister's overt objection to the accord put the brakes on the process. And when the Americans forced him to reignite it, it moved very slowly until the return to power of the Labour Party under Ehud Barak in 1999. Barak was determined to end the process in a final peace agreement, an impulse fully supported by the Clinton administration. Israel's final offer, delivered during discussions at Camp David in the summer of 2000, proposed a small Palestinian state, with a capital in Abu Dis, without significant dismantling of any settlements and no hope for return of the refugees. After the Palestinians rejected the deal, there was an informal attempt by the deputy Israeli foreign minister, Yossi Beilin, to offer a more reasonable deal. On the issue of refugees, he now agreed to their return to a future Palestinian state and symbolic repatriation to Israel. Yet these informal terms were never ratified by the state. Thanks to the leaking of key documents, known as the Palestine Papers, we have a better insight into the nature of the negotiations, and readers who wish to examine other aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations between 2001 and 2007 are advised to have a look at this accessible source. And yet, as negotiations collapsed, it was the Palestinian leadership, rather than the Israeli politicians, who were accused of being intransigent, leading to the collapse of Oslo. This does a disservice to those involved and how seriously the prospects of partition were taken. Right of return. The exclusion of the Palestinian right of return from the peace agenda is the second reason that made Oslo irrelevant as a peace process. While the partition principle reduced Palestine to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, under the Oslo Accord, the exclusion of the refugee issue, and that of the Palestinian minority inside Israel, shrunk the Palestinian people demographically to less than half of the Palestinian nation. The lack of attention to the refugee question during the peace negotiation was not new. Ever since the beginning of the peace efforts in post-mandatory Palestine, refugees have been exposed to a campaign of repression and negligence. Ever since the first peace conference on post-1948 Palestine, the Lausanne meeting of April 1949, the refugee problem was excluded from the peace agenda and disassociated from the concept of the Palestine conflict. Israel participated in this conference only because it was a precondition for its acceptance as a full member in the UN, which also demanded that Israel sign the May Protocol, in which it had to commit itself to the UN General Assembly Resolution 194. This included an unconditional call for the Palestinian refugees to be allowed to return to their homes, or to be given appropriate compensation. A day after the protocol was signed in May 1949, Israel was admitted to the UN and immediately retracted from its commitment to the protocol. In the wake of the June 1967 war, the world at large accepted the Israeli claim that the conflict in Palestine emerged from the territory that had to be occupied by the army. Several Arab regimes also cooperated with this notion, abandoning the refugee problem as an issue in their peace negotiations. However, the refugee camps soon became the site of intensive political, social, and cultural activity. It was there, for example, that the Palestinian liberation movement was reborn. It was only the United Nations that mentioned in several of its resolutions the obligation of the international community to ensure the full and unconditional repatriation of the Palestinian refugees. This was a commitment first made in Resolution 194, dated December 11, 1948. Still today, the UN includes a body named the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, though this has had little effect on the peace process. The Oslo Accord is no different. In this document, the refugee issue has been shuffled into a subclause, made almost invisible in the mass of words. The Palestinian partners to the accord contributed to this obfuscation, probably out of negligence, not bad intention, but the result is the same. The refugee problem, the heart of the Palestine conflict, a reality acknowledged by all the Palestinians wherever they are and by anyone sympathizing with the Palestinian cause, was marginalized in the Oslo documents. Instead, the issue was handled by a short-lived multilateral group who were asked to focus on the 1967 refugees, namely the Palestinians who were expelled or left after the June War. The Oslo Accord in fact substituted an embryo attempt, born out of the 1991 Madrid peace process, to form a multilateral group that would discuss the refugee issue on the basis of UN General Assembly Resolution 194. The multilateral group, led by the Canadians, who regarded the right of return as a myth, met throughout 1994, but then it petered out. Without any official announcement, this body finally stopped meeting, and even the fate of the 1967 refugees, more than 300,000, was abandoned. After 1993, the implementation of the accord only made things worse. The rules of the agreement defined the abandonment by the Palestinian leadership of the right of return. Thus, only 5 years after the cantonization of the Palestinian entity and its transformation into a Bantustan, the Palestinian leadership was given the permission to express its wish to deal with the refugee problem as part of the negotiations over the permanent settlement of the Palestine question. Nevertheless, the Israeli state was able to define the terms of discussion and so chose to distinguish between the introduction of the refugee problem as a legitimate Palestinian grievance, on the one hand, and, on the other, the demand for the right of return, which it was able to describe as a Palestinian provocation. The final stage of the peace process took place at Camp David in 2000. Here, the refugee issue did not fare any better in this last-ditch attempt to save the agreement. In January 2000, the Barak government presented a paper, endorsed by the American negotiators, which defined the parameters of the negotiations. This was an Israeli diktat and, until the summit was convened in the summer, the Palestinians failed to produce a counterproposal. In the summer, the final negotiations were in essence a combined Israeli and American effort to get the Palestinians to accept the paper. The paper included, among other things, an absolute and categorical rejection of the Palestinian right of return. It left open for discussion the number of Palestinian refugees that might be allowed to return to the territories controlled by the Palestinian Authority. All the sides concerned understood that these crammed areas were unable to absorb more people, while there is plenty of space for repatriating Palestinian refugees in the rest of Israel and Palestine. This part of the discussion was a meaningless gesture, introduced to silence criticism without offering any real solution. The peace process of the 1990s was no such thing. The insistence on partition and the exclusion of the refugee issue from the peace agenda rendered the Oslo process at best a military redeployment and rearrangement of Israeli control in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. At worst, it became a new arrangement of control that made life for the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip far worse than it was before. After 1995, the impact of the Oslo Accord as a factor that ruined Palestinian society, rather than bringing peace, became painfully clear. After Yitzhak Rabin's assassination and the election of Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996, the Oslo Accord became a discourse of peace that had no relevance to the reality on the ground. During the period of the talks, between 1996 and 1999, more settlements were built, more collective punishments were inflicted on the Palestinians. Even if you believed in the two-state solution in 1999, a tour of either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip would convince you, in the words of the Israeli scholar Meron Benvenisti, that Israel killed the two-state solution. So the Oslo process was not a peace process, and the Palestinian participation in it and their reluctance to continue it was not a sign of their intransigence and alleged violent political culture, but a natural response to a diplomacy that solidified and deepened Israeli control over the occupied territories. The Arafat myth. This then leads on to the second myth concerning the Oslo process, that Arafat's intransigence caused the Camp David summit to fail in 2000. Two questions have to be answered here. The first, what happened in the summer of 2000 in Camp David, who was responsible for the failure of that summit? Secondly, who was responsible for the violence of the Second Intifada? The two questions will help us engage directly with the common assumption that Arafat was a warmonger who came to Camp David to destroy the peace process and returned with a determination to start a new intifada. Before we answer these questions, we should remember the reality in the occupied territories on the day Arafat left for Camp David. My main argument here is that Arafat came to Camp David to change that reality while the Israelis and the Americans arrived there determined to maintain it. The Oslo process transformed the occupied territories into a geography of disaster, which meant that the Palestinians' quality of life was far worse after the accord than it was before. Already in 1994, Rabin's government had forced Arafat to accept its interpretation of how the Oslo Accord would be implemented on the ground. The West Bank was divided into the Infa Maus areas A, B and C. The Palestinian Authority controlled Area A and jointly with Israel, Area B. Area C was the one directly controlled by Israel and constituted half of the West Bank. Movement between, and inside, the areas became nearly impossible, and the West Bank was cut off from the Gaza Strip. Israel also divided the Gaza Strip. The settlers were a given small part of it and took over most of the water resources and lived in gated communities. The Palestinians were cordoned within barbed wire. Thus, here too, the end result meant that the peace process deteriorated the quality of Palestinian life. This was Arafat's choice in the summer of 2000 as he arrived at Camp David. He was being asked to sign off as a final settlement the irreversible facts on the ground that turned the idea of a two-state solution into an arrangement that at best would allow the Palestinians to have two small Bantustans and at worst would allow Israel to annex more territory. This agreement would also force him to give up any future Palestinian demands, or propose a way of alleviating some of the daily hardships most Palestinians suffered. We have a very authentic and reliable report of what happened in Camp David by the U.S. State Department's Hussein Agha and Robert Malley. Their detailed report appeared in the New York Review of Books and begins by dismissing the Israeli claim that Arafat wrecked the summit. The article makes the point that Arafat's main problem when coming to the summit was that, in the years since Oslo, life for the Palestinians in the occupied territories had only got worse. Quite reasonably, according to these two American officials, Arafat suggested that instead of rushing within 2 weeks to end the conflict for once and for all, Israel should agree to some measures that might restore the Palestinians' faith in the usefulness and benefits of the peace process. The period of 2 weeks, by the way, was not so much an Israeli demand, but rather a foolish timeframe insisted upon by President Clinton, who was considering his own legacy. There were two major issues that Arafat signaled as potential areas of discussion and which might improve the reality on the ground. The first was de-escalating the intensive colonization of the West Bank that had increased after Oslo. The second was putting an end to the daily brutalization of normal Palestinian life, manifested in severe restrictions of movement, frequent collective punishment, arrest without trial and constant humiliation at the checkpoints. All these practices appeared in the most callous way within every area where there was contact between the Israeli army, or the civil administration, the body running the territories, and the local population. According to the testimony of the U.S. officials, Barak refused to change Israel's policy towards the Jewish colonies or the daily abuse of the Palestinians. He took a tough position, which left Arafat with no choice. Whatever Barak depicted as a final settlement did not mean much if he could not promise immediate change in the reality on the ground. Arafat was, as expected, blamed by Israel and its allies of being a warmonger who, immediately after returning from Camp David, contemplated the Second Intifada. The myth here is that the Second Intifada was a terrorist attack sponsored and perhaps even planned by Yasser Arafat. The truth is, it was a mass demonstration of dissatisfaction with the betrayal of Oslo, compounded by the provocative action of Ariel Sharon. In September 2000, Sharon, as the leader of the opposition, toured Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, with massive security and media presence, igniting an explosion of protests. The initial Palestinian anger was translated into non-violent protest that was crushed by brutal force by Israel. The callous repression of these demonstrations led to a more desperate response, the suicide bombs that appeared as the last resort in the face of the strongest military power in the region. There is telling evidence by Israeli newspaper correspondents that their reports on the early stages of the Intifada, as a non-violent movement that was crushed violently by the Israeli army, were shelved by their editors so as to fit the narrative of the government. One of them was a deputy editor of Yedioth Ahronoth, the main daily, who wrote a book about the misinformation produced by the Israeli media on the early days of the Second Intifada. At the same time, official Israeli propagandists claimed this behavior reaffirmed the famous saying of the veteran Israeli super diplomat, Abba Eban, that the Palestinians do not miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. We have a better understanding today of what triggered such a furious Israeli reaction. In their book Boomerang, two senior Israeli journalists, Ofer Shela and Raviv Drucker, interviewed the General Chief of Staff and strategists in the Ministry of Defense and offered inside knowledge on the way these officials and generals were thinking about the issue. Their conclusion was that in the summer of 2000 the IDF was a frustrated outfit following its humiliating defeat by Hezbollah in Lebanon, who had forced the army to withdraw totally from Lebanon. There was a fear that this retreat made the army look weak, and so a show of strength was much needed. The reassertion of dominance within the occupied Palestinian territories was just the kind of display of sheer power the invincible Israeli army needed. The army was ordered to respond with all its might, and so it did. When Israel retaliated against a terror attack on a hotel in the ski resort city of Netanya in April 2002, where 30 people were killed, it was the first time the IDF used airplanes to bomb the dense Palestinian towns and refugee camps in the West Bank. Instead of hunting down the individuals who carried out these attacks, the most lethal and heavy weapons were brought to bear on innocent civilians. Another common reference that accompanied the blame game Israel and the U.S. played after the failure of the Camp David summit was reminding public opinion that there was a chronic problem with Palestinian leaders, who, at the moment of truth, exposed their warmongering ways. "There is no one to talk to on the Palestinian side," reappeared in that period as a common analysis by local pundits and commentators in Israel, Europe and the USA. These allegations are particularly cynical. The Israeli government and army had tried by force to impose their own version of Oslo, one that was meant to perpetuate the occupation forever but with Palestinian consent, and even an enfeebled Arafat could not accept it. He and so many other leaders, who could have led their people to reconciliation, were targeted by the Israelis, and most of them, probably Arafat himself included, were assassinated. Target killing of Palestinian leaders, including moderate ones, was not a new phenomenon in the conflict. Israel began this policy with the assassination of Ghassan Kanafani in 1972, a poet and writer, who could have led his people to reconciliation. The fact that he was targeted, a secular and leftist activist, is symbolic of the role Israel played in killing those Palestinians it regretted later for not being there as partners for peace. In May 2001, President George Bush Jr. appointed Senator George J. Mitchell as a special envoy to the Middle East conflict. Mitchell produced a report about the causes for the Second Intifada. He concluded, "We have no basis on which to conclude that there was a deliberate plan by the PA to initiate a campaign of violence at the first opportunity, or to conclude that there was a deliberate plan by the government of Israel to respond with lethal force." On the other hand, he blamed Ariel Sharon for provoking unrest by visiting and violating the sacredness of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the holy places of Islam. In short, even the disempowered Arafat realized that the Israeli interpretation of Oslo in 2000 meant the end of any hope for normal Palestinian life and doomed the Palestinians to more suffering in the future. This scenario was not only morally wrong in his eyes, but also would have strengthened, as he knew too well, those who regarded the armed struggle against Israel as the exclusive way to liberate Palestine. At any given moment, Israel could have stopped the Second Intifada, but the army needed a success. Only when this was achieved through the barbaric Operation Defensive Shield in 2002 and the building of the infamous apartheid wall did the Israelis succeed temporarily in quelling the Second Intifada. The West Bank, 2005 to 2017. By 2007, 40% of the West Bank was already under direct rule by Israel, or, in other words, annexed, for all intents and purposes, to Israel. Within this 40%, Israel solidified its presence with Bari airs, military bases, and closed military areas. Cynically, Israel declared them nature reserves. This policy focused on Area C of the West Bank, and its main purpose was to downsize the Palestinian population there. There were also calls from senior Israeli politicians to annex the area. In 1967, around 300,000 Palestinians lived in Area C. Today there are a mere 50,000. The Jewish population has increased from about 1,000 in 1967 to more than 400,000 today. Very much as in 1967, there has been constant fine-tuning of the mega-prison. The West Bank is not as much under siege as the Gaza Strip, but movement in and out is very restricted. People of the West Bank are banned from using Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. There are two major crossings for them into Jordan, one being the Allenby/King Hussein Bridge. This crossing is controlled by Israel. The other crossing, the Damaya Bridge, has been officially annexed to Israel. It is for commercial use and allows only the export of goods to Jordan, banning imports of any kind. Movement within the West Bank is also severely restricted. All major roads, in all about 700 kilometers, are apartheid roads. In other words, Palestinians are banned from using them. Control of the roads has tightened since 2007. Movement has become even more of a challenge since the Israeli authorities recently finished building a new highway, divided by a wall segregating the road into Jewish and Palestinian lanes, which bisects the West Bank in two from north to south. All over the West Bank, by December 2016, about 400,000 Israelis inhabited 121 settlements, officially recognized by the Israeli government, while about 375,000 Israelis live in settlements in East Jerusalem. There are approximately 100 further settlement outposts that are not officially recognized by the government, and are illegal under Israeli law, but have been provided with infrastructure, water, sewage and other services by the authorities. Whether Palestinians lived among the 40% or elsewhere in the West Bank, as the Independent Commission for Human Rights reported in 2010, they were exposed to a systematic campaign of human rights abuses by the Israelis, and quite often, and regrettably, also by the Palestinian Authority. Since 2005, the security forces of the PA have also been responsible for quite a few cases of torture, arrest, and arbitrary detention. This aspect of life still falls within the paradigm of the open prison, where prisoners themselves are observing the peace for the prison authorities. Gradually, the international community has become aware that not only are human and civil rights being endangered by the continued oppression, but the very economic existence of the West Bank is also threatened. According to a 2007 World Bank report, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank has destroyed the Palestinian economy. The only thing that has kept the economy alive to a certain extent is international aid. If this should cease, the economic reality would become even more precarious. As things currently stand, it is unlikely it will increase to the point where it can substantially alleviate the economic hardship faced by the people of the West Bank. The number of Palestinians who succeed in finding work in Israel, and for that matter in the settlements, is unclear, as many of them are there illegally. Recent estimates have put that number at around 100,000. This is also unlikely to help sustain the crumbling economy. The peace charade continued after 2005. It was injected with some hope when Barack Obama entered the White House, but all was in vain. The discourse of peace in Obama's time was about the Palestinian state. In May 2011, Obama officially announced U.S. support for a future Palestinian state, based on borders prior to the 1967 war, allow ing for land swaps where they were mutually agreeable between the two sides. Obama was the first U.S. president to formally support this idea. The fact that such a statement had no bearing whatsoever on the reality on the ground proved that the decision taken by Israel in June 1967 to offer the charade of peace as a substitute for international intervention in a genuine peace process was highly successful. This is a point further accentuated by the zero impact of similar initiatives effected by other countries. By September 2013, 134, 69.4%, of the 193 member states of the United Nations had recognized the state of Palestine within the Palestinian territories, and a few more probably followed suit, to no avail. The international community's unwillingness to act is demonstrated even when there are, on the face of it, concrete promises to act against Israeli policy. In January 2012, the European Union approved the Area C and Palestinian State Building report. The report said that Palestinian presence in Area C has been continuously undermined by Israel and that state-building efforts in Area C of the PA and the EU were of the utmost importance in order to support the creation of a contiguous and viable Palestinian state. The EU will back various projects to support the Palestinian people and help maintain their presence. In 2017, the incremental annexation of the West Bank continues, and the Palestinian state is more of a distant reality than ever. The last Palestinian campaign triggered a process in the UN for ending Israeli occupation. In September 2014, the PA appealed to the UN Security Council demanding that a timetable for such a process should be put into effect. Failing that, the PA threatened that it would appeal to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Since 2005, more Israelis have joined movements that harshly condemn Israeli policies. But even if they are numerous, they will only be effective if external pressure on Israel, as suggested and practiced by the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, is applied. The situation in the West Bank was not influenced by the ongoing condemnation by international jurists of this reality, as a severe violation of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. For a moment in December 2007, as so often in the past, an Israeli leader juggled impressively with words in an effort to deflect international outcry. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert decreed that all settler activities, including planning, in the West Bank, required the approval of both the Israeli Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. Deposed and imprisoned for corruption, Olmert had no opportunity to follow through this measure. The next government of Benjamin Netanyahu approved almost all the settlers' requests. In their turn, since 2005, the settlers have become even more brutal and barbarous in their treatment of the people of the West Bank, culminating in the burning alive of a teenager and an entire family. The Palestinians' steadfastness in the West Bank continues. Popular resistance is a daily occurrence, but with limited resources it is easily quashed by the Israeli occupation. However, in its tenacity it suggests that the final chapter to what began in 1967 has yet to be written. Today there are nearly 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and almost 400,000 settlers. Zionism as a settler colonial movement was able to colonize Palestine almost in its entirety, regardless of its demographic minority. These settlers, however, are much more powerful than the early Zionists, and it is unlikely that anyone will prevent them from taking over the rest of the West Bank, by one way or another. During that same period, Israel subjected the Gaza Strip to even harsher oppression and the most callous version of the maximum security prison to date. Chapter 12. The ultimate maximum security prison model, the Gaza Strip. 2004, the Dummy City. In 2004 the Israeli army began building a dummy Arab city in the Negev desert. It was the size of a real city, with streets, all of them given names, mosques, public buildings and cars. Built at a cost of $45 million, this phantom city became a fake Gaza in the winter of 2006, after Hezbollah fought Israel to a standstill in the north, so that the Israeli army could prepare to fight a better war against Hamas in the south. When the Israeli Chief of General Staff, Dan Halutz, visited the site after the Lebanon War, he told the press that soldiers were preparing for the scenario that will unfold in the dense neighborhood of Gaza City. A week into the bombardment of Gaza, Ehud Barak attended a rehearsal for the ground war. Foreign television crews filmed him as he watched ground troops conquer the mock city, storming the empty houses and no doubt killing the terrorists hiding in them. In 2009, the Israeli NGO Breaking the Silence published a report of its members, reserve soldiers and other soldiers' preparation for Operation Cast Lead, when the attack on the dummy city was replaced by an assault on the real Gaza. The gist of the testimonies was that the soldiers had orders to attack Gaza as if they were attacking a massive enemy stronghold. This became clear from the firepower employed, the absence of any orders or procedures about acting properly within a civilian environment, and the synchronized effort from land, sea, and air. Among the worst practices they rehearsed were the senseless demolition of houses, the spraying of civilians with phosphorus shells, the killing of innocent civilians by light weaponry, and obeying orders from their commanders generally to act with no moral compass. You feel like an infantile child with a magnifying glass that torments ants. You burn them, one soldier testified. In short, they practiced the total destruction of the real city as they trained in the mock city. This was the new version of the maximum security prison that awaited the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, as the Israeli government and its security policymakers realized that the open prison model, which was meant to enclose the people of the Strip under a collaborative rule of the PA, had been foiled by the people themselves. The retaliation that came in the form of besieging and blockading the Strip into surrendering to the preferred Israeli model had not worked either. The Palestinian political groups in the Strip, led by Hamas, decided to retaliate by launching occasional barrages of primitive missiles so that the world, and Israel, would not forget them and their life within a hermetically closed prison. This is how the Israeli fiasco unfolded in 2005, which turned into what I have referred to elsewhere as the incremental genocide of Palestine. The Israelis referred to their first operation against Gaza as First Rain. It was more a rain of fire from the sky than of blessed water from above. 2005, the First Rain. The militarization of the Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip began in 2005. That year Gaza became an official military target from the Israeli point of view, as if it were a huge enemy base rather than a place of civilian habitation. Gaza is a city like any other in the world, and yet for the Israelis it became a dummy city for soldiers to experiment with the most recent and advanced weapons. This policy was enabled by the Israeli government's decision to evict the Jewish settlers who had colonized the Gaza Strip since 1967. The settlers were allegedly moved as part of what the government described as a unilateral policy of disengagement, the argument being that since there was no progress in the peace talks with the Palestinians, it was up to Israel to determine how its borders with the Palestinian areas would ultimately look. In essence, Prime Minister Sharon was willing to turn the Strip into a West Bank Area A and in turn strengthen Israel's grip on the West Bank, and in evicting the Gazan settlers against their will, it would create an alleged trauma that would absolve Israel from ever repeating it again. But things did not turn out as expected. The eviction of the settlers was followed by a Hamas takeover, first in democratic elections, then in a preemptive coup staged to avert an American-backed seizure by Fatah. The immediate Israeli response was to impose an economic blockade on the Gaza Strip, to which Hamas retaliated by firing missiles at the nearest town to the Strip, Charade. This gave Israel the pretext to use its air force, artillery, and gunships. Israel claimed it was firing at the launching areas of the missiles, but in practice this meant anywhere and everywhere in the Strip. Creating the prison and throwing the key into the sea, as UN Special Rapporteur John Dugard has put it, was an action against which the Palestinians in Gaza reacted with force in September 2005. They were determined to show that at the very least they were still part of the West Bank and Palestine. That same month they launched the first significant barrage, in number only, not quality, of missiles into the western Negev. As so often, these resulted in damage to some properties but very rarely in human casualties. The events of that month deserve to be mentioned in detail, because the early Hamas response before September had been the sporadic trickle of missiles. The launching in September 2005 was in response to an Israeli campaign of mass arrests of Hamas and Islamic Jihad activists in the Tulkarem area. One could not escape the impression at the time that the army was looking to trigger a Hamas response. Indeed, when it came, it was a harsh policy of massive killings, the first of its kind, codenamed First Rain. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the nature of that operation. The discourse that accompanied it was one of punishment, and it resembled the punitive measures inflicted in the more distant past by colonial powers, and more recently by dictatorships, against rebels imprisoned or banished communities. A frightening show of aggression by the oppressor ended with large numbers of dead and wounded among the victims. In Operation First Rain, supersonic flights took place over Gaza to terrorize the entire population, followed by the heavy bombardment of vast areas from the sea, sky, and land. The logic, the Israeli army explained, was to create pressure in order to weaken the Gaza community's support for the rocket launchers. As everyone expected, the Israelis included, the operation only increased support for the rocket launchers and gave impetus to their next attempts. In hindsight, and especially given the Israeli military command Air's explanation that the army had long been preparing the 2008 to 2009 Operation Cast Lead, it is possible that the real purpose of that particular operation was experimental. And if the Israeli generals wanted to know how such operations would be received at home, in the region and in the wider world, it seems that the quick answer was very well, namely, No governments showed any interest in the scores of dead and hundreds of wounded Palestinians left behind after first rain subsided. Subsequent operations were along similar lines. The difference was in their escalation: more firepower, more casualties, and more collateral damage, and, as to be expected, a tighter siege and blockade. The Palestinians reacted with more Qassam missiles. The Lebanon humiliation and the Gaza compensation. Tank shelling, bombing from the air and the sea, and brutal incursions were frequent occurrences throughout 2006. But when Israel was defeated on another front, this time in southern Lebanon in the summer of 2006, the army intensified its punitive policy even more against 1.5 million people living in the most densely populated 40 square kilometers on the planet. Such was the brutality of the Israeli policy that it met the UN Article 2's definition of genocide, which stressed that it can be applied to actions against part of an ethnic or national population, and not necessarily against all of it. The kinds of weapon used by Israel, 1,000-kilo bombs, tanks, missiles from the air and shelling from the sea against civilian areas, were not intended to deter, wound, or warn. They were intended to kill. Not surprisingly, Hamas's reaction became more desperate. Quite a few observers inside and outside Israel attributed the Escala tie-in to a determination to show that the Israeli army had swiftly recovered from the humiliation meted out to it by Hezbollah in Lebanon. The army needed to show its superiority and deterrence capability, which it considered to be the primary safeguard of the Jewish state's survival in a hostile world. The Islamic nature of both Hamas and Hezbollah, and an alleged, and totally false, association of both with Al-Qaeda, enabled the army to imagine an Israel spear heading a global war against jihadism in Gaza. While George W. Bush was in office, the killing of women and babies in Gaza could be accepted even by the American administration, as part of that holy war against Islam. The worst month in 2006 for the Gazans was September, when this new pattern in the Israeli policy became all too obvious. Almost daily, civilians were killed by the IDF. September 2, 2006 was one such day. 3 citizens were killed and an entire family injured in Beit Hanoun. This was just the morning's harvest. Before the end of the day many more were killed. In September an average of 8 Palestinians died every day in Israeli attacks on the Strip, many of them children. Hundreds were maimed, wounded, and paralyzed. More than anything else, the systematic killing had the appearance of an inertia killing due to the absence of a clear policy. The Israeli leadership in September 2006 seemed to be at a loss as to what to do with the Gaza Strip. Reading its statements at the time, you get the impression that the government was quite confident about its policy towards the West Bank, but not towards the Strip. It perceived the West Bank, unlike the Strip, as an open space, at least on its eastern side. Hence Israel, under a strategy the Prime Minister of the day, Ehud Olmert, defined as the ingathering, was entitled to take unilateral action in the West Bank, since there was no progress in the peace process. In practice, it meant that the 2006 government wished to annex the parts it coveted, more or less half of the West Bank, and to try to push out, or at least enclose within it, the native population, while allowing the other half of the West Bank to develop in a way that would not endanger Israeli interests, either by being ruled by a submissive Palestinian authority or by associating directly with Jordan. This was a fallacy, but it nonetheless won the enthusiastic backing of most of the Jews in the country, when Olmert turned it into a key policy of his election campaign. However, this strategy could not be applied to the Gaza Strip. As early as 1967, Egypt, unlike Jordan, had succeeded in persuading the Israelis that the Gaza Strip was a liability for it and would never form part of Egypt. So 1.5 million Palestinians remained an Israeli problem and responsibility. Although geographically the Strip is located on the margins of the State of Israel, psychologically it still lay very much in its midst in 2006. The inhuman conditions in the Strip made it impossible for the people living there to reconcile themselves to the imprisonment Israel had imposed on them since 1967. There were relatively better periods when movement to the West Bank and into Israel for work was permitted, but such better times had gone by 2006. Harsher realities had been in place since 1987. Some access to the outside world was allowed as long as there were Jewish settlers in the Strip, but once they were removed the Strip was hermetically sealed. Ironically, most Israelis, according to the 2006 polls, regarded Gaza as an independent Palestinian state that Israel had graciously allowed to emerge. The leadership, and particularly the army, saw it as a prison with the most dangerous community of inmates, which had to be managed ruthlessly one way or another. The conventional Israeli policy of ethnic cleansing employed successfully in 1948 against half of Palestine's population, and against hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank in 1967, was of no use here. You could slowly transfer Palestinians out of the West Bank, and in particular out of the Greater Jerusalem area, but you could not do it in the Gaza Strip, once you had sealed it as a maximum security prison camp. The result, as I have argued elsewhere, was the onset of a policy of incremental genocide by Israel against the Gaza Strip. I have also explained how the various legal and moral definitions of genocide have been relevant to the Israeli policy in the Gaza Strip since 2006, so I will not repeat them here. Let me just say that every year I ponder afresh this problematic definition and nothing on the ground suggests that I am wrong. This is not necessarily an intentional policy of annihilation, but it is one that has brought about the slow destruction of the ability of people in the Strip to survive, as was recognized by a UN report in 2016 that predicted that in 2020 life in the Strip would be unsustainable. As with the ethnic cleansing operations, the unfolding genocidal policy that began in 2006 was not formulated in a vacuum. Since 1948, the Israeli army and government needed a pretext to commence such policies. The takeover of Palestine in 1948 produced the inevitable local resistance that in turn allowed the implementation of an ethnic cleansing policy, pre-planned in the 1930s. 20 years of Israeli occupation of the West Bank eventually led to some sort of Palestinian resistance. This belated anti-occupation struggle unleashed a new cleansing policy that was still intact in the West Bank in 2006 and an aggressive policy of massive killing in the Gaza Strip. The daily business of slaying Palestinians only reached the back pages of the local press. The Lebanon War provided the screen for a while, covering the sheer scale of destruction being wreaked on the Gaza Strip. However, the policies raged on even after the conclusion of the ceasefire up in the north. It seems that the frustrated and defeated Israeli army was even more determined to enlarge the killing fields in the Gaza Strip. The political elite seemed unable, or unwilling, to stop the generals. The daily killing of up to 10 civilians throughout 2006 left a large number dead by the end of the year. Such numbers are, of course, different from the destruction of 1 million people in a single campaign, an act more commonly defined by the international community as genocide. Indeed, one felt, at least until the 2009 massacre in Gaza, that, if only out of deference to Holocaust memory, Official Israel would balk at the prospect of committing genocide. On December 28, 2006, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem published its annual report about Israeli atrocities in the occupied territories. That year, Israeli forces killed 660 citizens. The number of Palestinians killed by Israel in 2006 tripled in comparison to the previous year, around 200. According to B'Tselem, the Israelis killed 141 children in 2006. Most of the dead were from the Gaza Strip, where Israeli forces demolished almost 300 houses and slew entire families. This means that since 2000, Israeli forces have killed almost 4,000 Palestinians, many of them children. More than 20,000 were wounded. B'Tselem is a conservative organization, and the numbers it quotes may be higher. It did not describe the killings as part of a policy of genocide. In a series of articles written that year and after, I chose to differ. The point I made was that the question of definition was not just numeric, it related to the trend and the strategy. As 2007 began, Israeli policymakers faced two very different realities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In the former, they were closer than ever to completing the delineation of their eastern border. Their internal ideological debate about the fate of the West Bank was nearly over, and their master plan for annexing half of the West Bank was being implemented at an ever-growing speed by the last months of 2006. The last phase was delayed because of the promises made by Israel, under the roadmap for peace, not to build new settlements. Israel found two ways of circumventing this alleged prohibition. First, it defined a third of the West Bank as Greater Jerusalem, which allowed it to build towns and community centers within this new annexed area. Secondly, it expanded old settlements to such an extent that there was no need to build new ones. This trend was given additional impetus in 2006 when hundreds of caravans were installed to delineate the boundaries of the Jewish sphere within the Palestinian territories. The planning schemes for the new towns and neighborhoods were finalized, and the apartheid bypass roads and highway system was completed. In all, the settlements, the army bases, the roads and the wall would allow Israel to complete the annexation in the following years. Within these territories there are still a considerable number of Palestinians against whom the Israeli authorities pursue slow and creeping transfer policies, too boring a subject for the Western media to bother with and too elusive for human rights organizations to make a general point about. There was no hurry as far as the Israelis were concerned. They felt at the beginning of 2007 that they had the upper hand there. The daily abusive and dehumanizing mechanisms of army and bureaucracy were as effective as ever in contributing their own share to the process of dispossession. This strategy was first conceived by Ariel Sharon in 2001 and became a political consensus. It won the day and was deemed the preferred strategy for the future in 2006, and much preferable to the one offered by the blunt transferists, or ethnic cleansers such as Avigdor Lieberman. He would repeat his advocacy for transfer once more at the end of 2016 as defense minister. It was endorsed as the way forward in 2006 and was accepted by everyone in the 2006 government, from Labour to Kadima, the new center party that Ariel Sharon founded with Shimon Peres and which lasted for a few years after Sharon's departure from political life in 2006. The petty crimes of state terrorism were also effective as they enabled critical, but loyal, support of the state around the world to softly condemn Israel and yet categorize any genuine criticism of Israel's criminal policies as anti-Semitism. This clarity on the policy towards the West Bank highlighted the confusion about Gaza. There was no clear Israeli strategy for the Gaza Strip at the beginning of 2007, but the difference between 2006 and 2007 was that the daily activity by the army in the Strip transformed into the strategy itself. Gaza, in the eyes of the Israelis, was a very different geopolitical entity from that of the West Bank. Hamas had already been controlling the Gaza Strip for almost a year, while the leader of Fatah, Abu Mazen, aka Mahmoud Abbas, was running the fragmented West Bank with Israeli and American blessing. Israel did not covet any chunk of land in the Strip, as it did in the West Bank, nor did the Strip have a hinterland, like Jordan, to which the Palestinians of Gaza could have been expelled. As mentioned before, ethnic cleansing was an ineffective option here. Up to 2007, the salient strategy in Gaza had been ghettoizing the Palestinians there, but this was no longer working. The ghettoized community continued to express its zest for life by firing primitive missiles into Israel. Ghettoizing or quarantining unwanted communities, even if they were regarded as subhuman or dangerous, had historically never been a solution. The Jews knew it best from their own history. Hamas's counteroperation culminated in the capture of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on Gaza's soil in June 2006. This incident was irrelevant in the general scheme of things, but nonetheless provided an opportunity for the Israelis to escalate even more the components of the tactical and allegedly punitive missions. After all, there was still no strategy that followed the tactical decision of Ariel Sharon to remove 8,000 settlers whose presence complicated punitive missions and whose eviction almost made him a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. Thereafter, the punitive actions continued and themselves became a strategy. The Israeli army loves drama and therefore also escalated its discourse. Operation First Rain was replaced by Summer Rains, a general name given to the punitive operations since June 2006, in a country where there is no rain in the summer. The only precipitation that one can expect are showers of F-16 bombs and artillery shells landing on the people of Gaza. Summer Rains introduced a novel component, the land invasion into parts of the Gaza Strip. This enabled the army to kill citizens even more effectively and to present it as a result of heavy fighting within densely populated areas, an inevitable result of the circumstances and not of Israeli policies. With the end of summer came Operation Autumn Clouds, which was even more efficient. On November 1, 2006, in less than 48 hours, the Israelis killed 70 civilians. By the end of that month, with additional mini-operations accompanying it, almost 200 were killed, half of them children and women. From First Rain to Autumn Clouds one could see escalation in every parameter. The first was the removal of the distinction between civilian and non-civilian targets. The senseless killing turned the population at large into the main target for the army's operation. The second was the escalation of the means to kill, employment of every possible killing machine the Israeli army possessed. Thirdly, the escalation was conspicuous for the number of casualties, with each operation and each future operation. A much larger number of people were killed and wounded. Finally, and most importantly, the operations became a strategy, the way Israel intended to solve the problem of the Gaza Strip. A creeping transfer in the West Bank and a measured genocidal policy in the Gaza Strip were the two strategies Israel also employed. In 2007, from an electoral point of view, the one in Gaza was more problematic as it did not reap any tangible results, while the West Bank under Abu Mazen was yielding to Israeli pressure and there seemed to be no significant force that could arrest the Israeli strategy of annexation and dispossession. However, Gaza continued to fire back. On the one hand, This enabled the Israeli army to initiate more massive genocidal operations, but on the other hand, there was also the great danger, as had happened in 1948, that the army would demand a more drastic and systematic, punitive, and collateral action against the besieged people of the Gaza Strip. 2007 to 2008, the policy becomes a strategy. The casualties were rising in 2007. 300 people were killed in the Gaza Strip, dozens of them children. However, during the George W. Bush administration and definitely after, the myth of the world jihad in Gaza had started to lose credibility. So a new mythology was proposed in 2007. The Strip was a terrorist-based deterrent mined to destroy Israel. The only way the Palestinians could be deterrorized, so to speak, was eliciting from them a consent to live in a strip encircled by barbed wire and walls. Supply, as well as movement, in and out of the strip depended on the political choice made by the Gazans. Should they persist in supporting Hamas, they would be effectively strangled and starved until they changed their ideological inclination. Should they succumb to the kind of politics Israel wished them to adopt, they would suffer the same fate as those on the West Bank, life without basic civil and human rights. They could either be inmates in the open prison of the West Bank or incarcerated in the maximum security one of the Gaza Strip. If they resisted, they were likely to be imprisoned without trial, or killed. This was Israel's message in 2007, and the people of the Gaza Strip were given a year, 2008, to make up their minds. A bilateral ceasefire was officially declared in the summer of 2008. Brokered by Egypt. The Israeli government did not achieve its goals. It needed to prepare more seriously for the next step and used that year for such preparations. Its strategy not only depended on silent Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but also consisted of desperate attempts to prove to the international body appointed to deal with the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Quartet, consisting of representatives from the EU, Russia, the USA and the UN, and the Palestine Authority, that the situation in the Strip was sufficiently under its control that it could be incorporated into an Israeli peace vision of the future. The summer of 2008 was 2 years after the humiliation of Lebanon. The Olmert government, which had led Israel into that war, was bitterly criticized in a damning report by an official inquiry into its failure in the north. The government did not want the Israeli public to dwell on this open wound for too long. Winds of change were also blowing from Washington, where it was feared a new administration would not be as sympathetic to the Israeli strategy, and, all in all, world public opinion, at least bottom-up, as it had been since 2000, seemed restless and antagonistic. The old method of waiting for the right pretext to move ahead and escalate the struggle against the only resistance still intact was at work once more. The training in the dummy city now became operational and was turned into a proper doctrine in the Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip. It was known as the Da'iyah Doctrine. In October 2008, Haaretz referred to this for the first time. The gist of it was the comprehensive destruction of areas in their entirety and the employment of unparalleled force in response to the launch of missiles. Haaretz referred to it as a possible scenario that could unfold in Lebanon, hence the Da'iyah reference, a Charade quarter in Beirut that was blown to smithereens in the 2006 Israeli air attack on the city. Gadi Eisenkot, the then chief of the Northern Command, said that, "For us villages are military bases." He talked about the total destruction of villages as a punitive action. His colleague at the top of the army, Colonel Gabi Saboni, confirmed that this would apply to the Gaza Strip as well. He added, this is meant to damage in such a way that it will take a long period to recover. Thus, all was ready for reigniting the Strip. The first step was tightening the siege on the Strip. This produced a shortage of basic foodstuffs, a lack of the simplest medicines, and caused massive claustrophobia for 1.5 million people who were not allowed to move out. The siege also included severe restrictions of fishing rights, which is one of the Strip's main sources of income. The highly sophisticated yet idle Israeli Navy has been mainly occupied in chasing small dinghies and fishing boats in recent years. Hamas did not budge and refused to go away in return for the lifting of the blockade. Thus another pretext was sought. Israel violated the ceasefire in several attacks from the air and by incursion on the land on a daily basis during 1 week, in June 2008. Consequently, groups that were not affiliated to Hamas retaliated with several rockets, and the public opinion in Israel was now prepared for a larger operation. To reinforce the point, in November 2008 the Israeli army attacked a tunnel, one of many dug in order to survive the blockade, and claimed that it was a preemptive strike against a future Hamas operation. This time Hamas fired the rockets. It lost 6 people in the attack and launched a barrage of more than 30 rockets. At the end of the month, Hamas declared that such Israeli actions, which had become a daily occurrence, had terminated the ceasefire. On November 18, 2008, Hamas declared the end of the ceasefire and on the 24th intensified the barrage of missiles for a short time, in response to the previous Israeli action, before ceasing after a while. As before, there were hardly any casualties on the Israeli side, although houses and flats were damaged and the afflicted citizens traumatized. The November 24 missile attack was what the Israeli army was waiting for. From the following morning until January 21, 2009, it bombarded the 1.5 million people of Gaza from the air, land, and sea. Hamas responded with missiles that caused 3 casualties and another 10 Israeli soldiers were killed, some by friendly fire. The evidence collected by Israeli-based human rights organizations, by international agencies and the media. Although the Israelis barred the media from entering the Strip, some of it repeated in the Goldstone report, which was both a very conservative and guarded summary of what occurred, reveals the true dimension of the massacre in Gaza in that period. The South African Justice, Richard Goldstone, was appointed by the UN at the head of a fact-finding mission for the events in Gaza in 2009. The nearly 1,500 killed and thousands of wounded, and tens of thousands who lost their homes, do not tell the whole story. Only the use of military force in the confines of such a space populated by civilians could produce the kind of collateral damage that was seen. It also displayed a desire on the army's part to try out new weaponry, all intended to kill civilians, as part of what the former chief of the Army General Staff, Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, termed the need to imprint upon the Palestinian consciousness the fearsome might of the Israeli army. A new, more cynical dimension was now added. International and Arab aid promised billions to help rebuild what Israel would probably destroy again in the future. Even the worst disaster can be profitable. The next round of aggression occurred in 2012 with 2 operations, returning Echo, which was smaller than the previous ones and escalated from a border clash, and, more significantly, Pillar of Defense in July 2012, which ended that summer's social protest movement in Israel. Hundreds of thousands of middle-class Israelis demonstrated for a few months, threatening to bring down the government for its economic and social policies. There is nothing like a war in the South to convince young Israelis to stop their protesting and go and defend the homeland. It worked before, and it worked this time as well. In 2012, Hamas reached Tel Aviv for the first time, with missiles that caused little damage and no casualties. Typical of the familiar imbalance that year, 200 Palestinians were killed, including 10 children. This was not a bad year for Israel. An exhausted EU and US administration did not even condemn the 2012 attacks. In fact, they repeatedly cited Israel's right to defend itself. No wonder that 2 years later the Israelis realized they could go even further. Operation Protective Edge, in the summer of 2014, had been in the planning stage for 2 years, and the abduction and killing of 3 settlers in the West Bank provided the pretext for a destructive operation that killed 2,200 Palestinians. Israel itself was paralyzed for a while as Hamas rockets even reached Ben Gurion Airport. For the first time, the Israeli army tried to take on the Palestinian guerrillas face-to-face in the Strip and lost 66 soldiers in the confrontation. This was a bit like a police force entering a maximum security prison in which the prisoners are besieged and running their own lives. You control them mainly from the outside parameters, and you put yourself in danger if you try to invade it. To confront the desperation and resilience of those you are trying to starve and slowly squeeze the life out of. The Israelis knew all too well that such confrontation had to be avoided, and therefore they still opted to use massive firepower, which, in the words of the army, contained the situation in the Strip rather than leading to the destruction of Hamas. The war in Syria and the refugee crisis left little room for international action or interest. However, it seems everything is poised for yet another round of aggression against the people of Gaza. The UN predicted that, at such a rate of hostilities, by 2020 the Strip would become uninhabitable. This would be caused not only by military force but by what the UN called de-development, a process whereby development is reversed. 3 Israeli military operations in the past 6 years, in addition to 8 years of economic blockade, have ravaged the already debilitated infrastructure of Gaza, shattered its productive base, left no time for meaningful reconstruction or economic recovery, and impoverished the Palestinian population in Gaza, rendering their economic well-being worse than the level of 2 decades previous. This death sentence is even more likely since the military coup in Egypt. The new regime there has added its own closure on the only opening Gaza has, outside of Israel. Since 2010, the civil societies have sent flotillas of ships to show solidarity and break the siege. One of them, the Mavi Marmara, was viciously attacked by Israeli commandos, who killed 9 of the passengers and arrested the rest. Other flotillas were treated better. However, the 2020 prediction still remains, and it seems that in order to avoid this happening, the people of the Gaza Strip will need more than peaceful flotillas to persuade the Israelis to stop bringing about the slow death of Gaza. The monstrous megaprison Israel contemplated in 1963, and then built in 1967, is 50 years old as this book comes to a close. The 3rd generation of inmates are still there, waiting for the world to acknowledge their suffering and to realize that, as long as their oppression continues, it will be impossible to engage constructively with oppression elsewhere in the Middle East, and in particular in Syria. The immunity Israel has received over the last 50 years encourages others, regimes and oppositions alike, to believe that human and civil rights are irrelevant in the Middle East. The dismantling of the megaprison in Palestine will send a different, and more hopeful, message to everyone living in this troubled part of the world. Thanks for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, subscribe, and comment.